Okay, we're good to go on all platforms.
Thank you,
We
Mark.
are ready to go. Then in that case, before I call this meeting to order, I want to announce that due to COVID-19, commissioner, staff, and the public are all attending remotely by Zoom. All participants should join, who are joining either by computer or by phone, should mute their phones or their computer audio when they are not speaking to avoid background noise. During the meeting, please make sure that you announce yourself by name and by title every time you speak, so that those who are participating at a distance know who is speaking. This is critical given the number of remote participants and is current guidance from the Kansas Attorney General. At this point, I want to welcome everyone to this month's meeting of the Neighborhood and Community Development Standing Committee, and I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Roll call. Walters.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Townsend.
Here.
Burrows.
Here.
McKiernan.
Here. Thank you so much. In terms of revisions to the agenda, there have been 2 revisions to the agenda that was originally published for this meeting. First of all, the item that was number 2, an ordinance temporarily lifting certain zoning restrictions due to COVID-19, has been taken off of today's agenda. That is the information that we will consider as an entire commission at our special meeting this coming Thursday. And we have a new item added, which is now item 3, and that is an item regarding 3 MARC Mid-America Regional Council Planning Sustainable Places grants. So I want to make sure that all of the committee members have the updated agenda, which I do now. If that is the case, that everyone has the updated blue sheets and the updated agenda, our next item of business is to approve our minutes from the meeting of April 6th, 2020.
Move to approve. This is Commissioner Townsend, District 1.
Commissioner Burrows, move to approve. Second.
So there's a motion by Commissioner Townsend, and a second by Commissioner Burrows to approve those minutes as submitted. And Bridget, like we've done for the last couple of meetings, let's go ahead and do a roll call vote just to make sure that we get everybody.
Roll call. Walters.
Yes.
Johnson.
Aye.
Townsend.
Aye.
Burrows.
Aye.
McKiernan.
Aye, thank you so much. That takes us now to our committee agenda. The first item on the committee agenda is the same as with the original agenda, and that is a presentation on Stories on Stories project. And I would assume that Logan Massentine is going to give this presentation, but I don't see her quite yet.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm here. We are going to be presenting as a group effort. This project is in coordination with SOAR, Parks and Recreation, the Metropolitan Organization Countering Sexual Assault, and Wyandotte Behavioral Health Network.
So sorry, Logan, is my internet is having some connectivity issues, but is one of us going to be able to share our screen to do the presentation?
Rocky was given the presentation. How does that work? Sorry, guys.
Logan, you will share your screen and go ahead and present.
Okay, then does Shelby have the power to do that as well?
Yes, everybody does.
Okay, great.
Great, so we'll just go ahead and get started. And as I said, I apologize if I'm having any connectivity issues. Please holler at me if I freeze up on you. But my name is Vanessa Crawford-Aragon. I'm the Community Prevention Coordinator for MOXA. There's actually a number of folks that are, as Logan mentioned, who've been part of this project. So how about if we just let everybody introduce themselves when you first start talking? Does that seem like a good way to do it, guys? I'll go ahead and give a quick overview of this project and our overall coalition. And if at any point you have any questions, please feel free to stop me. So Shelby, could you advance the slide? Thanks. Most folks, I think, know our organization, MOXA, for our direct services to survivors of sexual assault and abuse. But this is a project of our Community Prevention Coalition, which is the Wyandotte County Sexual Assault Prevention Coalition. We have been in existence for a number of years, and our main mission is looking at systemic causes of violence and what kind of changes we can make as a community that make violence less likely to happen. So we're not just providing services to people after they have already experienced violence, but what can we do together as an entire community to prevent that violence from happening? And we have a wide variety of different types of partners in that. We have a number of UG agencies, community organizations, some faith community partners. And the main focuses that we have taken in that work has been how do we improve neighborhood connectedness? So we know if neighbors know each other and people have access to supportive people in their lives, they're less likely to experience violence or to perpetrate violence. Can we address environmental factors that make a neighborhood less safe? We know that experiencing violence in a neighborhood impacts violence that happens inside homes in a neighborhood too. We're also trying to address harmful norms that impact violence. So things like harmful norms about masculinity and femininity, harmful norms like that violence is acceptable under some circumstances or a natural consequence in some circumstances. And as you think about all these different types of violence, we point out that the same things that cause sexual violence also impact lots of other different types of violence. They impact child abuse, they impact street violence, they impact intimate partner violence, violence between strangers. And so by zooming out to these big community level issues, we're able to address not just one type of violence, but a lot of different types of violence at the same time. And that also leads us to be able to have innovative projects like this one, where we can pull together partners that aren't the usual suspects that are working on violence all the time, but who are working on a lot of different types of issues. So Shelby, if you want to go ahead and advance. Thank you. So we actually are part of this project, is part of the Community Health Improvement Plan. MOXA is the lead agency for the violence prevention portion of the CHIP. As you well know, the rest of those are access to care, safe and affordable housing, and jobs and educational opportunity. So we are very happy to be part of that. And this project, I think, fits really squarely into a lot of the objectives that are trying to be accomplished through the CHIP. So that's the main background about the coalition and how we got here. So.
Hi there. My name is Tiffany Friesen, and I work for Wyandotte Behavioral Health Network. I am the program manager for the ART program, and I'm also heavily involved in trauma-informed care, as well as educating our staff in the community in that. So what is Stories on Stories? Stories on Stories is a project that uses art created by neighborhood members that then will go up on boarded up vacant houses or other buildings. And it's a collaborative effort between the residents and neighborhood groups. Each neighborhood provides art that tells their own story. So this is a way of reclaiming the narratives within some of these neighborhoods in a way that's positive and creates connection and collaboration. When we know our neighbors, we know that we are more likely to look out for each other, and that in turn not only decreases risk of break-in and like negative activities, but it also helps people get to know each other and look out for each other and create connections that may not have been as strong otherwise.
Hi, I'm Shelby Woodward. I'm also with MOXA. I'm a prevention specialist. So a question that we get sometimes revolves around how art projects like this can decrease crime and violence in neighborhoods. We know it's not always like a clear line between the two. So we've done a lot of work in Wyandotte County with crime prevention through environmental design. I know that some of you are familiar. I know some neighborhood groups are familiar. So it is briefly, it's the idea that changing our built or physical environments changes how people interact with it. We talk a lot about trimming bushes so they don't become hiding spaces, places to hide. We talk a lot about streetlights and their importance when it comes to residents being able to see their neighborhoods and communities. So when we think about how art can impact violence, we utilize some of the ideas from SEPTED. So first off, reduction of blight shows that residents care about and want to maintain the places that they live. When a neighborhood is blighted, it looks like people don't care. So when it's maintained, when things are properly taken care of, it shows that that neighborhood is watched, that people value where they live and they want the best for it. So when this happens, it can also reduce violence and break-ins and dumping on those vacant properties in the surrounding areas. So again, if a place is maintained, that largely means that residents around are watching what happens there. And when people are watching what happens, negative acts are less likely to happen. It's also been shown in other communities to reduce violence. And by it, I mean art projects like this. A big thing is that, I think the biggest thing is that when we get the community together to do something good, not only is the property being maintained, is the area being maintained, but the neighbors get to know each other and they get to know what's going on in their neighborhood. And that community connectedness is really important in violence prevention.
Hi everyone, my name's Anna Grace and I'm the Violence Prevention AmeriCorps Vista working with MOXA. So the Stories on Stories project was first piloted in the Rosedale area along Southwest Boulevard. We had a lot of help from the Rosedale Development Association. Their volunteers helped us canvass the surrounding neighborhoods to inform the residents of the project and receive their input. And then we had the students in RDA's Rainbow Summer Youth Program help design the art for this and future potential sites in the area. And this first installation happened in September 2019 by the WICO SAP coalition members, as well as other volunteers. And that top picture on the left is that installation.
Hi, Logan Messentine, Unified Government SOAR Coordinator. So the process for this project will be that the CHIP subcommittee, the SOAR program, Parks and Rec, and WICO SAP will work together to identify a neighborhood with a high rate of violent crime, as well as enough blighted or vacant boarded properties that we can complete these projects on. The committee will then communicate with the residents in the surrounding area to receive their input on the artwork, as well as some survey questions on their perception of safety and community connectedness. We might also collaborate with some youth serving organizations in the areas to get that done. The community-centered art will then be submitted and printed, just 8.5 by 11 regular printer paper, and then installed through a wheat pasting technique, which is weather friendly and easy to use, easy to repair, pretty affordable medium. Then afterwards, we will conduct a post-installation survey to see if anyone's perception of safety has changed or how they feel about their neighborhood after the project.
So these are some examples of art that was made for Stories on Stories. We engage youth programming that already exists. So different programs, whether that's schools or the Rosedale, their Rainbow program. But the idea is we ask kids who live in the neighborhood that the art will be going up in, what would make you feel welcome, valued, safe, and connected? So it really comes back to belonging. What's the story that you want to tell in your neighborhood? How do you want to communicate welcome, valued, connected, and safe? And so you can see some of these art pieces, and they can also be colored in person. So whenever they're installed, they're printed black and white, and then they're colored by the neighborhood children or volunteers. It also is helpful because whenever we have art up on buildings that's made by kids or people who live in the neighborhood, they're more likely to check in up on it. And it doesn't have to just be written art. It also can be photos. It could be historical photos. We really want to hear what the narrative is that neighbors want to hear, want to tell about where they live, that invokes a sense of pride and belonging.
Hi, this is Kristen Love. I work with the Unified Government Parks and Rec. So looking forward, we will analyze the stability of the art, how much maintenance we might have to do on that property after the art is up, and based on the surveys, how much the neighborhood likes the project. Through coordination with a lot of different departments, we have decided that we will first start on unified government-owned buildings, and then based on our findings from the previous studies on the stability, if we should expand to the non-unified government-owned buildings. If that's the direction we decide to go, we're going to create an authorization form very similar to the one that Operation Brightside uses for when a property is often hit with graffiti. This would allow the property owners the property owners would allow somebody from the unified government to come and remedy the situation with the art. The form will be included along with some information about Stories and Stories when the property owner goes into the NRC to get their boarding permit. Then the project will be continued with the privately owned structures once they're authorized. And the first unified government owned building that we're looking to do this on is actually the old bathhouse out at Clifton Park. As you can see, it has already been boarded. So we will then be wheat pasting all of the intentional messaging onto the boards up there.
And in addition to the Clifton Park building, we would also like to consider some other UG owned properties. So we thought we would start with the land bank, and we've identified a few land bank houses that didn't have as much interest from the contractors. So they are less likely to be rehabbed anytime soon. So that means the boards will stay longer. So we've identified these few houses that we think would make good sites for this project. And then we overlaid this map of violent crimes by district. So the darker shades are the more violent crimes. So there's a few areas in there where we think that this project would do really well. And you'll notice that some of these are in Commissioner Townsend and Commissioner Johnson and McKiernan's district. So we would be happy to get your feedback on that.
And these are all of the partners that you've worked with to try to come up with this. Very interesting. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, these are just some of the, you can see those of us who are here on this call, but there's a lot of other folks that we've been working with too. So just wanted to, make sure to note those. And that's it.
Fantastic. We'll get some feedback from the commission. I see that Commissioner Townsend has some interest here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Townsend, District 1. Want to commend Mosca and all the UG participants and all the other partners on this project. This is very interesting. And I think Ms. Massive, these braces are killing me. Ms. Logan.
Yes, no worries.
And Ms. Love may have already answered a couple, but just a couple of questions I had, but just for the record, I'm going to go down the list. And the first one had to do with, again, the impact of this project on our rehab, the UG's house rehab project, which to date has been quite successful. So if I understand what you said, Ms. Logan, the houses that may be candidates for this are the ones least likely to appeal to contractors, or they're kind of on the bottom of the list as possibles. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And we're starting off with houses that are already in the land bank and are otherwise owned by the UG. So one of the questions I was concerned about was grass cutting and upkeep and that type of thing, but that's already on our dime to take care of anyway. Okay. All right. Community participation on what this art will look like and what it goes up. Again, how is that process done? Quickly, because I want neighbors not to be off-put with whatever is up there. So will they get a chance to have input onto what the art looks like?
Absolutely. Thank you for that point, Commissioner. That is very, very important to this project. It's really the foundation of this project is the community input and the neighborhood connectedness. So because of the pandemic, we are going to be a little challenged to get those neighbors to participate in the way that we had originally planned. However, we do still have quite a few ideas. We are planning on engaging with the MBRs, the neighborhood groups, any other community organizations, churches, livable neighborhoods, any groups that already meet and have connections. We plan on utilizing those. We also have some ideas to get flyers out. Tiffany has drafted a few videos to kind of display the art. We definitely have to think outside the bubble this summer, but that is very important to us.
Okay.
And some of the beauty in this project is that it actually all of it could be submitted digitally. So we can collect things from people without actually having to see them face to face. As long as we're getting their input, we can work from there and make edits. And every step of the way, it's based on neighbor engagement.
Okay. Because of what you're trying to do with this in terms of prevention of crime in certain areas and making the neighborhoods looked lived in and cared about, and because of Mosca's involvement, do you ever use artwork that is submitted by survivors of sexual assault? Because some of the art that I saw was cute and kind of on the young side. So are there any other possibilities for submission of art that even more directly addresses the goal of this project?
Yeah, I would say yes, and that Tiffany or anybody else is welcome to chime in as well. And this is Vanessa from Moxa again. I think that is a really great possibility. As I mentioned, or as we've said, all of the art that's going in is what gets submitted by the community and what the community decides that they want. So I think that would drive that. I don't think that we've solicited anyone specifically as survivors, but we definitely know that anytime you're talking to a lot of people in the community, you're going to be talking to survivors. And so I think that that's a really great opportunity. And if that's the kind of thing that folks in the neighborhood wanted to put up, I think that we are in a pretty good place to be able to help facilitate that.
Yeah, I appreciate those budding artists who submitted drawings, but if we could get on a level 2, that goes a little bit more to what the real goal of this is, aside from improving a blighted looking situation. I think that would be great. And to that, this has been done, did you say in the Rosedale area already?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, do we have any stats on how that project may have directly reduced crime or reduced loitering in the area where those houses are, since these are the areas you're targeting for this project?
Mm-hmm. So we had intended to do that post survey that Logan had mentioned of the neighborhood this spring, but social distancing really put a hamper on that. I think that we do need to go back and look at the long-term crime trends in that neighborhood, which is work that we had been doing on an ongoing basis. So I don't think that I have direct stats that I could share with you now. I think that we're still trying to make that determination.
Okay, and I'm with you. I'm not trying to gather any more people to gather in a group that need to be, but since apparently there were stats, I guess, gathered from the police department that helped you target certain areas, I would think you should be able to get some type of before and after, maybe from
Yes.
the police department.
Yes, yes. And I should also say, when we did the initial project with Rosedale, it was largely because RDA was enthusiastic about the project and invited us, and that was a building that was, fit our criteria at the time. I think that within buildings that we are doing this year, we're trying to be much more intentional about focusing it in neighborhoods that are experiencing higher rates of violence. So yeah, the overall impact on crime and violence is measurement in the chip that we're tracking.
Okay, so in the case of Rosedale, that organization came to you with a proposed house that they had in mind for this project?
Not exactly. No, I believe Vanessa connected with RDA just fairly organically through other networking. And then we went and found a structure. Our original goal was actually to do more than one, but the additional structure we wanted to do actually got rehabbed, which is good news long term, but it didn't work out for the project.
Okay, I think I've covered all the ones I have. I'm sure maybe some of my other fellow commissioners have questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Townsend. This is Commissioner McKiernan. I would say that I really like this idea. I've seen some personal evidence in our neighborhood here in the Cathedral neighborhood when Steve Curtis and the art squad did murals on alley-facing garage doors. It was a tremendously positive thing in the neighborhood. And so I look forward to this. One thing I would share, and this piggybacks a little bit on something that Commissioner Townsend said, and that is anything that we can do to help spruce up the building and the grounds that this art goes on will absolutely synergize with the art. And I'm looking at the building at Kensington and thinking, boy, if we could either with UG crews or with properly spaced neighborhood crews, if we could clean up the grounds, for example, around the perimeter of that building, it would really add to the positive impact of the art. So I'll just throw that out there.
Mr. Chairman, one more thing on that point. Whenever this art is installed, who is responsible for keeping it up? Because weather can be rough on art and the exterior of the house. Who's responsible for the upkeep of that?
Thanks, Commissioner. We did provide a detailed process map that should be in your agenda packet, but I know that's wordy. Basically, oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I didn't see it, but that's about what I can say.
So code enforcement is already very aware of the unified government owned properties. So they have every intention of keeping an eye out to see if these will need maintenance or upkeep. We also plan on engaging the neighborhood groups and whatever residents end up helping with the project so that we have a lot of eyes to make sure that it looks good. And if anything does happen, UG staff, so a member of the SOAR team will go out and remediate it and will be trained by our artist, Tiffany.
Great, thank you.
And just to clarify, the process of repair is incredibly easy and cost effective and easily done by anyone. And I mean, it's very little cost, so.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I want to say I like the idea that Commissioner Townsend mentioned relative to having other artists, perhaps even older artists, that would have their art forms telling their stories as well as also included in our overall package of what is offered to the community. I guess I have a different question in terms of what she asked. Do you know what the shelf life is on these on this type of material relative to the wear and tear? Is that going to, if we do something on a particular property, will it last us a year, 3 years, 5 years? Is there any data that can show you how long the shelf life would be on that?
Yeah, so I'm doing a number of experiments testing, and I've been testing them at home with power washing. So really subjecting it to a lot of pain to make sure to see how long it lasts. This technique, I mean, there are artists who have wheat paste up from the 90s still up in New York City. So they can last a really long time as long as the formula is perfected. And I am very dedicating to making sure that we get that correct. So ideally, I mean, they would last much longer than a year.
Okay. The last question I have, and I asked this on our meeting, but just for the public, can you talk about the cost factor in terms of what that would cost for the whole program relative to the cost of providing the material and whatever else would go along with that?
Yeah, thank you. So the majority of this project is very low cost. The supplies, as Tiffany mentioned, are very affordable. I can let Vanessa speak a little bit about a grant that Moxa received, but other than that, it's just a little bit of staff time on SOAR's part, and there is not much other cost associated.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and so just to say that, you know, we were able to cover the cost of supplies and equipment through some, you know, a relatively small grant that we got as part of our role in the CHIP. And so, yeah, a lot of that is already covered. And as I mentioned in our conversation the other day, really the most intensive portion of this project is, you know, the time that it takes to do the neighborhood engagement. It's a lot more shoe leather and elbow grease than anything else. So yeah, we don't expect much more cost.
Fantastic. Any other comments or questions from the committee on this presentation? I don't see anything. So what this item was for information only. And so to Logan and to the rest of the team, we certainly thank you for the presentation. We thank you for the work. Look forward to seeing this project moving forward as we all gradually get back outside and out and about in the community. Really look forward to this project. If there's anything else that you all need from us, you know where to find us. Come on back. Otherwise, thanks for the presentation. Best of luck moving forward. That will take us then, oops, I got to go back and find my agenda over here. Since item number 2 was removed from our original agenda, we now have a new item number 3. This will be an action item for the committee. It is 3 grants related to Mark's Planning Sustainable Places program. And I'm going to ask Mr. Gunnar Hand, who's our Director of Urban Planning, to do the presentation for the committee. Mr. Hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, this is Gunnar Hand, Director of Urban Planning. We wanted to present to you all tonight the 3 PSP Planning Sustainable Places grants that we're would like to pursue through the Mid-American Regional Council's grant process. And I was going to go over each one individually, and then I was going to follow that up with sort of a little bit of background on sort of the strategy about all 3 grants. So the first one is for a countywide mobility and transit-oriented development strategy. One of the first things I did when I started about 2 months ago as I began to do an assessment of all the existing plans that we have, as well as sort of all the different staff, capabilities, programs, all the things that we've been doing. And one of the things that I noticed was two things actually. Is one, although it has been only 12 years, it is our countywide master plan is a little out of date, as it speaks to a lot of issues that have either come to pass or are well behind us at this point. And as we undergo a systematic sort of review of all of our area plans, as well as an issuance of area plans that don't currently have an area plan, it has sort of risen to the surface that we are in my opinion, in great need of understanding our transportation system holistically. We've been working closely with Public Works on a lot of different projects, but one of them that keeps coming to the top of the list as well is figuring out how to integrate their priority project process and capital improvement plan process into a more streamlined and understanding. And we believe collectively, urban planning and Public Works and some of the other departments that we've been coordinating with, that we need to understand where people are moving to and from and why, to answer all of these questions. We need to understand those critical answers to those critical questions so that we can then develop a land use policy and strategy that supports those transportation corridors and infrastructure projects. And we believe a long-range countywide mobility plan would be a part of that. We have reached out to Bonner Springs and Edwardsville. We have a meeting set up with their city managers to bring them on board. The way that we understand and have reviewed the scoring criteria for these PSP grants, as well as sort of how we think this is sort of a structural rethink of our transportation network, not just in terms of automobiles, but certainly from a multimodal perspective. You know, we also have a sidewalk and trails master plan that's aging, that could, and its update could be folded into a process like this. Public Works had instigated about a year or so ago a project to update their, to develop some transportation demand model, which was not completed and could be sort of dovetailed into this process. So there's a lot of synergies across the department in terms of working collaboratively across different UG family members. And what we're thinking is that this countywide mobility plan, again, based on scoring, it's at the bare minimum is an 80-20. But considering the scope of the project, as well as some additional points you get by going above the 80-20 match, we were committed to basically looking at the full opportunity match of $150,000 by doing a complete 50-50. We believe that this would show the commitment of the UG on this project. We are currently in the process, well, as soon as after this meeting, I guess, we're going to get going on sort of writing the narrative about how this would bring in a bunch of different community, not just organizations, but stakeholders, obviously you all, and the different relevant departments to kind of move forward with it. And so in a sense, the strategy here is to put all our eggs in one basket. This year for marked PSP grants, there's $600,000 total for all counties in Kansas. That's the largest it's been ever. And so we think we have a pretty good shot at this chunk, specifically if it comes in as kind of like our #1 top priority. So Mr. Chair, do you want me to go through all three of them, or do you want to stop and talk about questions for each one?
Got to find my own unmute button here, don't I? I'm pretty much going to leave that to the committee. If there are members of the committee who would like to actually stop, you know what, I'm going to make an executive decision here. We only have 3. We have them listed on the blue sheet with the amounts. Why don't you go ahead and run through the rest of them, and we'll gather all questions at the same time.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the second one is Northeast Heritage Trail. This was actually brought to us by Groundworks Energy, formerly the Northeast Area Community Group. They, in their planning process and as an extension, really an implementation of the Northeast Area Master Plan, are looking to develop a heritage trail from Caw Point to the Condero town site. Again, this is a transportation project that could also be part and parcel of a countywide mobility and TOD development strategy. The way that Groundworks Energy is thinking about this one is they don't have a route yet. They have 2 destinations and they want to figure out all the in-betweens. They're loosely thinking it'll follow Jersey Creek, a lot of the existing, some of that of which could be used as the existing trails along Parallel Parkway. But they want to essentially return land bank property into community use, identify a route that sort of strings together different either historical sites or sites of significance. Doesn't necessarily have to be a building. It could be just a overlook or a place or a piece of land where a building once was. But also in the spirit of the MARC PSP grants, one being transportation, one being land use, and the third being sort of environmental stewardship, if you will, is trying to figure out what that overlay would look like, what that best alternative route would look like that could also maximize stormwater management. So it's kind of a 3-for-1 project. And this planning process would be a sort of a corridor planning process that would work through those different issues. And then what they are, although we still have some follow-up with them on the scope, I think we're loosely thinking that's probably about a $100,000 grant. We would seek just the 80-20 match, which would be $20,000 from us. Now, Groundworks Energy is going to do all the heavy lifting in terms of writing that grant application, but they are not technically allowed to put that forward to MARC. So they've asked us to do that for them. I think it's a great idea. Again, I think it could be folded into the mobility plan. And it is very much in line with a lot of the implementation actions that were identified in the Northeast Area Plan, which was adopted just a few years ago. The third one on our list was brought to us by our peer cities adjacent to us, Merriam, Overland Park, and Mission. And essentially it's a corridor study from downtown Merriam to Rosedale. Essentially right where Rosedale turns into Southwest Boulevard, or excuse me, Merriam Lane turns into Southwest Boulevard at Rosedale. And if you know that stretch of road, it's sort of the in-between 2 different destinations. And it is part of what you could consider a very historic transportation route. It's the old interurban line. It's the reason that Merriam exists, quite frankly. And so we were thinking about developing a land use and transportation strategy, one that would sort of close some of the gaps that exist along Turkey Creek, figure out some better connections from Marion Lane to Turkey Creek, because there's a lot of infrastructure in between, but there are some opportunities there. But really developed a land use strategy along that, the bulk of which is in the UG, if you look at it just by the numbers in terms of road length. But they have, Overland Park in particular, has said that it's, since it was their kind of pitch, they're going to do the heavy lifting on the grant. We believe that one is probably a little bit more than 100. We're thinking about $150,000 would be our estimate thus far. Again, we are currently thinking we'll split it 4 ways evenly between the 40 municipalities. So that one would potentially cost us $7,500 if we did receive that grant. Again, I think that one is a mobility project that could be a part of a long-range countywide mobility and TOD strategy. And I keep pushing that caveat back to the mobility plan, because at the end of the day, these are all scored by MARC and chosen based on that score, not by how much money you have. And so what a lot of municipalities take the strategy, including our own in the past, is we should go after all the ones that we can, see if we get selected, and then it becomes and then we move into the step in the conversation about, well, how much can we actually support financially? And I have told both the Northeast Area Plan and the cities around the Merriam Corridor Lane that there is a possibility, eyes wide open, that if we find ourselves in that excellent situation where we have to, choose the best project or how much money we have for the best project, that we'll have to have that conversation at a later date. So I think it's in a way it puts it off, but it's one of those things where, especially in MARC grants, is you kind of have to put a couple in potentially to score. You do get points for repeats, persistence, if you will, and then you learn from that process as well, and then it becomes a little more socialized amongst the people who do select a MARC. So it's kind of there's a strategy to here, but What we would propose is that if it does become a situation where we have to pick between them, that we would move forward with the mobility plan, a countywide strategy, and then certainly at a lesser scope of a degree, but we could easily fold both of these into a conversation at the mobility plan level, and then potentially have another planning document that could score more points where we want to dive in. The other thing to point out here is there's 3 different categories of MARC PSP grants. One is these sort of larger long-range plans. One is somewhere in the middle where you're kind of focusing on either a corridor or a specific project like a trail. And then there's another one where you're focusing on an intersection within that project, if you will. So a lot of MARC PSP grants go for like $30,000 to redesign an intersection. There's quite a few that go to, you know, 50 to 100 to do that kind of corridor planning strategy. And then the biggest pot of money, and quite frankly, it's not the hardest to get because it's the most contested. It's the hardest to get because it's the biggest ask, which is why we propose to put 50-50 in for the mobility plan, is the larger long range plot. But again, our strategy is not to put all our eggs in one basket necessarily, but go for all of them that have been, you know, sort of discussed across the community, and put a lot of effort into the mobility strategy, because we do think it's a catch-all for all 3.
Very good. Thank you very much. So we have 3 possibles here: the countywide mobility and POD strategy. We have the Northeast Heritage Trail and the Merriam Lane Corridor Plan. And if I do my math right, we would potentially be asking for a total of $550,000 in grant funds over the 3. And we might have to come up with, if all of those were approved for us, we might end up coming up with $182,500 locally. But if I understand correctly, we can apply, and if we are scored, and if the grant is eligible to be awarded to us, we are not obligated to move forward unless we have the capacity to provide the local match.
That is correct.
That's correct. Perfect. Well, I know a couple of members of the committee have some comments and some questions, so I'll recognize Commissioner Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Townsend, District 1. I think, Mr. Chairman, oh, good evening, Mr. Hand. I think Chairman just identified my general questions about whether or not we can go for all 3, how much our match would be if we were successful.
It's okay. I'm just going to take.
And then at that time, determine if we, the UG, is in a position financially to accept. Is that correct? That's pretty much the summary?
That is correct.
Okay. Looking at the Northeast Heritage Trail, this is very interesting. I've heard this talked about before. I had a question about what was meant by using or returning vacant land, vacant property back to the community's use. What does this grant anticipate doing in regard to that? Taking property out of the land bank that may already be there. And my concern is that we not foreclose opportunities anywhere for development by chopping up certain areas along the route. That may not be what this means, but that's my concern. The other thing is, do you know if there was any discussion about not using land, but taking some type of water route, say from Caw Point around to, say, the Overlook? That would certainly be an interesting heritage trail via water option.
In regards to your questions, I think that if I'm understanding the second question right, I think I can answer them both at the same time. Groundworks Energy was actually hoping to follow the watershed, i.e. the drainage channel, as a mechanism by which you could develop a trail system. Now, again, we kind of already do that. along the improvements along Parallel Parkway. But when you're working your way to get over to the Quindaro town site, which pathway you take is kind of open-ended. So the thought here, and we still have to define the scope, and we have a follow-up conversation with them next week based on this conversation here. The thought is, how do you combine best practices in either green infrastructure or stormwater management, which is something that Public Works has been working on diligently the last couple of years, with the land bank properties that do exist in the Northeast, of which we all know there are a lot. Those parcels have been identified as potential opportunities for investment from a private sector standpoint, like you say, but also potentially from some sort of holdover strategy, if you will, through something like I would propose this trail. But we have to kind of do that analysis, right? I think you could easily bake into a potential application, and then if we are awarded eventual scope of work, exactly your concern, which is we want to build this trail, we want to do it in a way that we can build it in an area that probably wouldn't get developed anyway, i.e. like, a ravine with a stream in it, but also in a way that promotes economic development or the development of these parcels as well. So we might minimize the amount of land bank property we would need to build the trail, but we could also, again, from my perspective, I think something like this could become, we used to call it in the private sector world, trail-oriented development. There is quite a few, not just from a functional commuter type perspective, but if this was truly a heritage trail where we're linking up landmarks and telling a story, a broader narrative about the history of the community, that's an economic development tool. I would argue that trail could spur the economic development that we want and need in the Northeast. And that would be, I think that is exactly what Northeast Energy is proposing. I would also mention really quickly, because I forgot to say it, and it's in the list here, is there's a chance they might be able to pony up that full $20,000. But again, it's a conversation that we're just kind of at the point where we want to get through this stage and then put that conversation off until if we get selected. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. From what I understood you to say, my concern about not shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak, while we develop trails for future development out of the land bank is being considered. That is my main.
Yeah, I think it's as simple as during the planning process, we look at it as maybe as easements on those property as opposed to pulling them off. Or if there are certain properties that make sense, which we can, maybe that's part of the criteria in selecting a route, is minimizes the amount of land bank property that could be turned over to development, but also maximizes economic development potential. And I think, I don't know, you all or the community or all of us together, quite frankly, would have to have that conversation. Are we willing to trade one land bank property for a trail with the opportunity of creating an impetus for development on 5 more? And so I think that's those are the conversations you have in a planning process. But I think your concern can be addressed specifically as within a scope of work for sure.
Okay. The other point similar to this is, along this, are you looking to actually develop a trail that can be physically walked from, say, Call Point out there, because that's quite a haul, or merely stationing certain markers along a determined route? And that goes back to your easement issue. Instead of tying up land that may be developable, simply putting prominent markers along the route.
I believe the intent is to do both.
Okay.
So if we could develop the best route with this planning process, the thinking would be is we could come back in a future cycle with Mark PSP and design either a gap that we identify in that route. We could do along Jersey Creek from, I think it ends at 5th to 18th. And then maybe from 18th, we turn north. And that's where we find out there's a gap after the school, or maybe we go through the school. And then, again, there's a myriad of possibilities here, but the thinking would be is we could come back for a grant to identify one of the larger gaps, thereby connecting two existing segments of a trail. And I think that's really where we want to have the planning process, is get the biggest bang for our buck by using what's already out there, identifying those gaps. Hopefully those gaps can have some sort of stormwater management impact as well. And then maybe coming back later and designing pieces of that, like doing the engineering work for pieces of that trail system. But their thinking is that it would be an actual bike ped trail that would have landmarks, historical landmarkers along the way. And I think we just kind of have to see what routes come up in that process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Let's see, Commissioner Johnson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Gund, I really just have a comment. I really appreciate your strategy in terms of taking all three of the projects to them for submittal, and then working at it and from the other side in terms of how to find these. You just don't know what might turn up. So I'm glad to be able to hear that we're going to throw all of them up, out to be considered for approval. The one thing that I was thinking through this, and I'm pretty sure that what I'm going to ask is probably not going to be acceptable, is I was just wondering if in fact we did use property that is in the land bank, could the value of that property be utilized relative to our portion of the match? I don't think it can. I'm talking through this because that money, there has to be some currency that is transferred or sent to Mid-America Regional Council, as far as I know. Can you maybe lead me or guide me along that thought process, or shoot it down either way?
Well, for the Mark PSP planning grants, it's cash. They don't do in kind. So unless we could figure out a way to leverage the value into dollars of those land bank properties, then no, that wouldn't fly. But that doesn't mean your thought process is wrong. It might just maybe be premature. I think if we were to get through a planning process, part of that planning process could be to identify how we would leverage those parcels to maybe, instead of pay for a planning grant or engineering, could we leverage them to build the trail? Could it be a part of, maybe it's depending on what the property is and depending on the kind of economic development we could spur. I mean, we could work with economic development, quite frankly, and Catherine's on the call right now, so she might want to chime in here, but maybe there's something where we could leverage that as some sort of in-kind, either to issue something and pay for it, or just simply to say, if you want to build on this property, this is an improvement you have to build. I mean, we do that all the time with sidewalks. This could just be a 10-foot. I mean, we're not talking about anything fancy. We're basically talking about a 10-foot sidewalk through a piece of property. And so if you want to develop it, I think it would become one more trail on our sidewalk and trails master plan that we implement when projects come through. So I think in that sense, I think you're thinking in the right direction.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed. We'll see what happens. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And the other thing I wanted to point out here is we are moving forward with these planning grants on the assumption, and this is still an assumption, that the 2021 budget is my long-range planning budget. And if that is the case, I have all the money to do this next year. And if it gets cut, that's where we have to have this conversation or share the pot across UG families. But again, that's a different conversation. Our assumption is that for what I get every year to do long-range planning, I could leverage all of it to do our share of all three of these and continue with our commitment to the Armourdale community to do their area plan.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Walters, please.
You're on mute, sir.
Commissioner Walters, I believe you are still muted. If you could double check that, we can't hear you.
Did I take care of that?
There we go.
I'm sorry. So I'll start over. I want to thank staff for bringing this forward. I want to thank Mr. Hand for his research and advocacy for these kind of planning projects. I'm a big supporter of planning projects. I think you mentioned, and I'll just repeat that projects that do involve multiple jurisdictions do get a favorable evaluation and at the PSP review. So the one that involves all 3 cities in Wyandotte County is good. The one that involves the cities in Johnson County is good. And I think those will be looked on favorably. I do think that we should go forward with all 3 of these projects. And so if that's appropriate, I'd like to make a motion that we adopt the recommendation as submitted.
Thank you, Commissioner. There is a motion on the table. I'll turn it to Commissioner Burrows, and then we'll follow up on your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hand, you had your presentation. I really appreciate the work you put into this. The question I have, I just want clarification. You stated you believe you had the monies already set aside to meet the 100, and I believe you said 180,000 needed for the grants, all 3?
In my long range planning budget for 2020, assuming that it doesn't change for COVID-19, which we know it will, but yes.
And if it doesn't, if those monies aren't there, what suggestions or guidelines or guidance do you plan to prepare for us to give consideration to?
Are you saying if my 2021 budget is impacted?
That's correct. If that money isn't there, what do you have one of the projects that you would like to see move forward versus all 3? Just curious. We're up against some financial challenges, and that's
right.
all we've heard for the last week.
Sure.
So
no, it's completely understandable. Mine would be a 2-part. I would propose that the mobility plan moves first. Again, because it could include both planning activities. Also, because honestly, I could probably get, for $7,500, I could probably get the other 3 communities to pony up the cash and provide our support and or in kind on the Merriam Lane stuff. And there's a chance that Groundworks Energy could pay for theirs. So I think our attention we should keep our eye on the prize, if you will, on the mobility plan. So if we got reduced down to, let's just say 150, then that's what we would do. If we got reduced down below that, then I think we would have the opportunity to go back to Mark and potentially rescore, not assuming the 50-50 split, but maybe going all the way down to the 80-20. And again, we're showing a strong support by going 50-50. I can almost guarantee you no other community would go in 50-50 on any of these projects moving forward. And that's why I think we're sort of already building it into the proposal. Even if we were 25-75, we would still get the points for doing more than 80-20. But so it is, again, it's not a risk, but I think it is going all in, but that's how important I think the countywide mobility plan is. I think it is the thing we need to do ahead of updating our long-range transportation plan. Ahead of updating our long-range master plan, so that we can go into communities and area plans with a county-wide strategy. It is hard pressed to, again, we've already made the commitment to Armourdale, but I think it would serve us greatly to go into that next community, specifically one that doesn't have an area plan like Argentine or Turner, and say, this is what the county strategy is on transportation land use. How do we build that out in this area plan? Otherwise, we're kind of shooting from the hip.
Understood, and I appreciate your overview as to what would happen if we had to cut back on the finances. That'll be a discussion as we move forward working on the budget. But as you well know, every one of the commissioners has been talked to in reference to no monies available for anything. And so I'm not trying to shoot down your proposal. I just know that we're going to have quite a challenge ahead of us when it comes to finances. And yours is the first grant request outside of the Safer grant the other night. So I commend your presentation this evening, and we'll see where this goes.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner. Back to Commissioner Townsend, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, with that cautionary note from Commissioner Burrows, which I wholeheartedly agree with, I would like to second Commissioner Walters' motion to at least move this forward for review and approval by the full commission. So that's my second.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate that. So we have a motion and a second to move forward with all three. Any other discussion from the committee? Seeing none, roll call. I'm sorry, Commissioner Burrows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate, I tried to get my hand up quicker. The question I have, if this takes a unanimous vote, if this is unanimous vote, go straight to the committee onto the consent calendar, correct?
That is correct.
If it has a nay vote, then we will have discussion with the full committee, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So there's a motion and a second. Commissioner Walters.
Anything that's on the consent agenda can always be removed from the consent agenda for.
Absolutely correct.
So we don't have to be strategic on our voting to think that something won't be able to be discussed at full commission. I just wanted to point that out.
Absolutely correct. We have the capacity to pull any item that is on consent if we want to have a more thorough discussion or even a presentation at full commission. Commissioner Townsend put her hand down. I think she was going to make the same point. Seeing no other requests for input, let's have roll call, please.
Roll call. Walters.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Townsend.
Aye.
Burrows.
Aye.
McKiernan.
Aye. Thank you so much. Mr. Hand, thank you very much for your presentation tonight and for bringing these forward. That is the last item of business for this committee with no further items on the agenda. Neighborhood and Community Development is adjourned. We'll have a very brief switch over here and I'll turn it over to Commissioner Burrows for Economic Development and Finance.
Are we ready? Okay, before I call the meeting to order, I want to announce that due to COVID-19, the committee members, staff, and the public are attending remotely via Zoom. All participants joining by phone should mute their phones when not speaking to avoid any background noise. During the meeting, please make sure that you announce yourself by name and title every time you speak so the public that is observing knows who is speaking. This is critical given the number of remote participants and its current guidelines from the Kansas Attorney General. And due to the COVID-19 requirements, public comment has been suspended unless otherwise required by law. The public has been allowed to submit comments by email prior to the meeting, and those comments will be included in the recording of this meeting. With that, I will welcome everyone this evening, and I will now call the meeting of the Economic Development and Finance Standing Committee to order. I want to welcome you this evening, and at this point, I would ask the clerk to please call roll.
Roll call. Bryant.
Here.
Walters.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Townsend.
Here.
McKiernan.
Here.
Burrows.
Here. Thank you, committee. Our first order of business is the minutes from the April 2nd meeting. I would entertain a motion for approval.
Move to approve Commissioner Townsend, District 1.
Second, McKiernan, District 2.
There's been a motion.
Motion
and
to
a
approve,
second.
Johnson.
There's been a motion, 2 seconds. Thank you, committee. I appreciate that. With that, I guess we should go ahead and call roll on that just to ensure that everyone has a chance to be recorded for the minutes. So I'll ask the clerk again to please call the roll.
Roll call Bryant,
Aye.
Walters,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Townsend,
Aye.
McKiernan,
Aye.
Burrows.
Aye. Thank you, committee. When we utilize Zoom, it's important that we ensure that we know who is saying aye and you have your vote recorded. Committee, tonight we have 3 items on our agenda this evening. I don't believe there has been an addition to the agenda. Are there any revisions tonight?
There are no revisions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Item number 1 is the year-end 2019 fund balances. This is for information only, and we will have Kathleen Von Atchen, our CFO, give us an overview. Kathleen?
Thank you, Chairman. This is Kathleen Von Atchen, the Chief Financial Officer, and tonight we're going to be presenting how the year-end balances, how the unified government's governmental funds performed during 2019. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so this is for information only. We're providing this information to provide you a basis from which future decision-making can be made regarding the unified government's budget. So at the end of 2019, we ended up with what we call reserves. That's the amount of money that has accumulated that was unspent in the prior years, plus the revenue brought in 2019, less how much we spent. So this year, or this evening, we're going to first talk about the city, the county, and the parks combined general fund. And we're going to talk a little bit about how sales tax is economically sensitive. And then we're going to talk about the other special revenue funds that we have about 30 different funds. Some of them are what they call enterprise funds, but these, the remaining ones are special revenue funds. And those are the ones we're going to talk a little bit about, along with their legal authority of how to be spent and what the resources are restricted for. Pardon me. Right off the bat, we just wanted to give you an overview of the city general fund, just to give you an idea of how are the actual revenues compared with budgeted estimates for the combined general fund. So the combined general fund is the city, the county, and the parks, consolidated city county parks fund combined. And, you know, over the past 10 or so years, there's a graph here, and the green is, I'm having trouble with this thing here. Oh, good. So the green is at actuals, and the brown or red color is the budgeted number. And well, a lot of finance directors will tend to underestimate revenues, and then hoping that they'll come in higher than predicted, and of course I was hoping for that too, but in the past 2 years that hasn't taken place. So at the end of 2019, the budgeted revenue estimate was about $3.3 million higher than the actuals coming in. And I can tell you straight up that that's because the electric pilot came in much lower than I anticipated. And that's because actually we looked at the consumption level for the electric utility at the BPU, and it was quite a bit lower last year. It just kind of took a turn towards the latter part of the year. So that's the reason for that. On the expenditure side for 2019, we estimated our budget to be $8.5 million greater than what we actually spent in the general fund. So that's, and you can see typically the unified government's general fund underspends its budget. You can see all those brown bars over the past years being higher than the green. In fact, that's true for all the years. So the net between revenues and expenditures, and then you add in how much balances you had in the prior year, and you come up with a new fund balance. And so this is a graph of the general fund, combined general fund, total fund balance on a CAFR basis using GAAP as a percentage of total expenditures and transfers. So as you can see, when we first consolidated, we were at 36%, dropped down to 18% during the .com kind of recession. It came back up to 34%. And then as the Great Recession hit, it dropped down to a low of 7% in 2010 due to the decline in real estate values. It kind of hovered around this area. In 2015, Moody's downgraded the unified government to a single A. S&P still has us at AA. And since then, since 2015, thanks to your prudent financial management and the work of the administration, we have been able to build that fund balance back up to around the 17% level. Past 3 years, it's been at around 20%, and that's where it ends in 2019, roughly at 23 or 20.3% of expenditures. So the total 19 actual estimate has fund balance of 20% total expenditures and transfers. In 2020, the budget assumes a use of reserves of $3.5 million in reserves, and that's part of the original budget, but that was before the COVID pandemic hit. And so right now we're all looking to basically redo the current year budget in the middle of the year.
Kathleen, Chairman Burrows, the 3.5 million of reserve, can you share with the public as to why we chose to take the 3.5 million?
Well, so the quandary with in local government is that typically the revenues do not grow as fast as the expenditures. And so we have a lot of obligations, and over time, it's difficult to keep the revenue base high enough to support all of our obligations. In general, I believe that the administration and all of you on the commission felt that typically our vacancy rate on salaries and the level of spending is typically less than what is budgeted. So as you can tell from this chart here, see? And so that 3.5 sort of bakes in the expectation that we'll spend under our budget. So, and so let me go to the next chart, I'll show you. So like, for example, in 19, we'll get there. In 19, we actually grew our fund balance because we spent less than we anticipated. So,
Mr. Chair,
true almost in every year.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, please.
Can I ask a question before we go to the next slide?
Yes, please, by all means. I have no way of knowing who's raised their hand, so please don't hesitate to let me know if you want to speak.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Kathleen, you notate on that bar graph that on that chart rather that the Moody's downgrade to A1 happened in 2014. Can you tell us what our grade is now relative to the improvements that we've been making over the course of time since then?
Right. So it happened in like February of 2015, downgrade. And Moody's had us on negative watch for a number of years. And so when they saw this 9%, that's when they went ahead and downgraded. But since then, Moody's has not changed their rating, even though we have made a lot of progress. And so, and the reason for that is that they have concerns about the market value of the residential and commercial properties in our community are less than would be anticipated for a community of our size. And so generally the income level and the economics of the community in general don't really convince them that we're due for an increase. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Walters' hand is raised.
Thank you. Commissioner Walters, please. I don't believe you're unmuted yet, Mr. Walters.
My apologies.
Okay.
Simple question. Why are we looking at a combined city, county, parks department graph instead of individual?
So we're looking at the city general fund combined because that's how the credit rating agencies judge our financial performance. They look at the entire city, city, county, and parks general funds combined. Yeah, and that's how we discuss the reserves in the in the reserve policy that you all adopted several years ago. We're happy to provide information in the future as part of the budget process with each general fund separated out. So.
Any other questions, committee? If there's no other hands raised, Mr. Walters, did you get your question answered?
I got the question answered, but I do think it's more meaningful to look at the individual funds. We manage those funds independently. We look at mill levy increases and decreases on each fund, which ultimately determines the reserves in those funds. So this is interesting, and I will watch it. But I'm really more interested in the individual funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walters, and I appreciate those statements. I believe you and I run very parallel on those issues. Thank you. Kathleen?
Well, as part of the budget process, we provide information on each fund. This is just the year-end balances. So. As a reminder, we have a Unified Government General Fund minimum reserve policy. The reserve policy, as a reminder, is that, which was adopted in June of 2018, is that we retain in our reserve an operating reserve of 2 months of ongoing operating expenditures, and 2 months equates to roughly 17%. Because if you divide 2 into 12, you get 16.7%. So we just round up to 17 to make it easier. If you add, and then the policy also hopes to achieve over the future an additional month to address economic uncertainty and emergency reserve, which 1 into 12 is roughly 8%. So the two combined results in a total fund balance, kind of minimum fund balance of 25%. And what we do is we measure this as of December 31st as part of the CAFR financial audit. And that's the thing, is our CAFR financial audit combines all three of the funds together to further answer Commissioner Walters' question. So now, one thing, just as a reminder, given the current situation with COVID, that I just wanted to remind you that if a minimum target reserve is foreseen to be likely not to be met at some future point or within the next 5 years, or then during the annual budget process, we will bring that to the attention of the mayor and all of you commissioners. And then we're going to provide you with a plan of how to replenish the reserves over a future 5-year period. So that's if our minimum reserve hits below the 2 months. Okay. Now, just as a reminder, providing this for information, there's a lot of words on this page, but in the policy itself, it defines what the difference between an operating reserve and an economic uncertainty and emergency reserve. So the operating reserve is defined, excuse me, to be maintained to meet general operating needs and to allow for some budget uncertainty, such as the revenue estimate that I had for the pilot. I need to drink something. The economic uncertainty or emergency reserve is recommended and may be targeted to be assigned to provide resources during economic downturns or to address vulnerabilities to extreme events and emergencies impacting public safety concerns. So when I was looking at these two definitions, the current circumstance with COVID-19, the pandemic, it sort of crosses between the definitions of both of these. So because it certainly was an unexpected revenue shortfall that we're anticipating, but it also is a one-time public safety kind of emergency. So I think our policy is a little flexible in this instance. All right. So here's in 2019, as I mentioned, we actually added to our reserve, the reserve amount that was at the end of 18, compared to 19, it's now $2.7 million greater. So at the end of 18, it was roughly $40 million, and we added 2.7, so now it's at $42.7 million, which is 20.3% or 20% of the expenditures and transfers. So just so you know, the 2 months of expenditures and transfers, or 16.7%, equates to $35 million of that 42. So the remaining 7.7 is essentially what would be in the emergency bucket. And we haven't really ever talked about that in that way, but just so you know, that's the two buckets right now.
And Kathleen,
yeah,
this is Commissioner Burrows. The emergency reserve, instead of going with the 3 months reserve that the commission chose to install the emergency reserve, at any one time, will that emergency reserve in total meet a 1 month reserve criteria that would take us up to 3 months?
Well, so I don't remember I haven't done the math offhand, but as you can see, we're at 20% and the operating reserve is roughly 17%. So the extra 1 month, you're sort of halfway there is my point. So, you know, if we had another roughly $7 or $8 million in our reserve, we would likely be at that 25%.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think that
Something like that.
that I wanted to bring that point up specifically because we didn't go with 3 months reserves. We went with 2 months reserves and an emergency reserve. And it allows us at the same time to, one, have our stable reserves that we know will be 2 months, but it allows us to put additional reserves aside without cramping the budget to the extent that we feel we need 3 months budget and an emergency. So I appreciate your statement. Thank you. Any other questions from the committee in reference to
Commissioner Burrows, this is Jeff Bryant.
Yes, please go ahead, Jeff.
Kathleen, so it's roughly $17.5 million a month of expenditures, transfers, and operating reserve. So I know the biggest hit has to be sales tax revenue for the last couple months. As far as revenue overall, what percentage level of revenue are we still receiving of the expected 100%? Are we still getting 60% of it, 70% of it? You have a feel for what in the just in the last couple months where we've struggled the most?
Oh, okay. Well, so for sales tax, I'm projecting as part of the budget that our sales tax revenue, which is the second largest revenue source of the general fund, is going to be declining by 20%. So that was made in a presentation I gave as part of the budget workshop #1, and several presentations previously. Now your question, what am I seeing most recently? The problem is that we don't receive sales tax data until 2 weeks or 2 months after the actual transaction has occurred. So at the end of, a few days ago, we received our May distribution from the state of Kansas, and that was for transactions through March. So, or basically the March transactions. So as you know, there was the closure occurred roughly the second or third week of March, but there was a lot of stock up buying, especially at grocery stores and various places. And of course, not all retail activities ceased as part of the closure because some of those stores were deemed essential, especially some of the larger box stores. So what we found, and I was just looking at the sales tax data for the distribution we received 2 days ago for the March activity, is that it actually, the 2%, which is the 1% city and county sales tax, actually performed very consistently with last year's March, activity. But the sales tax that is derived from the Legends area, the Star Bond money, that area, the sales tax dropped 37% compared with the prior year, same period.
So if you're anticipating roughly a 20% drop or decline for at least the 2 months, and you say that sales tax is the second largest revenue source, what percentage of our overall revenue is sales tax? Is it 40%?
Okay, so my 20% reduction is actually for the entire year. So it includes the really solid performance of the past four or 5 months, but also anticipates a prolonged reduction in revenue in the future 7 months. And so then sales tax roughly is roughly around between 25% of the total revenues in the general fund. So.
Okay, because I'm just,
but it's about 25%.
okay, I'm just trying to gauge, you know, if it's 17.5 million a month of, you know, expenditures, what length of time the fund balance has before it gets down below, you know,
Well,
back down into that less than 17 or 15% where, you know, I think it was critical before.
Mhm. Yeah, well, we've done that analysis. That isn't actually the purpose of this presentation, but I think I have a slide coming up that shows the impact.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Johnson has his hand raised.
Yeah.
Commissioner Johnson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Kathleen, thank you for this presentation. Just dovetailing off of what Mr. Bryant was just talking about, I think what your response really gave me at least a sense of how important it is that we keep the legends moving forward. Just the percentage drop as it relates to the overall sales tax drop, how much of it is related to the legends speaks to the fact of how important that is for our community for sure. My other comment or question was relative to the 2 months versus the 3 months that you all had before I came on this committee. Where do our peers and the industry standard speak to in terms of the levels that we need to maintain? You know, I can recall back to my banking days, you know, the numbers were much larger, but of course the economy was much better at that particular time. So years ago, we would talk about 3 to 6%, 3 to 6 months rather. Now we're talking about 2 to 3 months. Where do our peers line up with regard to that, and what is the typical industry standard relative to those predictions in those matrix?
Okay, so the Government Finance Officers Association is a national organization of all the local government and state government, municipal public finance folks, and they have a number of recommended practices, and they recommend that for an operating reserve that you have 2 months of expended, ongoing expenses set aside in order to meet, basic liquidity issues, which is, you're not bouncing any checks throughout the year. So you have enough liquid assets to pay your bills. Now the second, the emergency reserve, it's actually based on a risk assessment. So the likelihood and the cost that is expected if you were to be in a pandemic and a tornado and floods, and if you suddenly, other catastrophic events, right? And so, of course, the likelihood that all 3 or 4 of those things is going to happen all at the same time is pretty unlikely. But there's a statistical risk assessment that's done. And so I did that risk assessment, and I went through the analysis to perform that risk assessment. And what it told me was that an additional 1 month will cover all the likelihood that any of those things would happen. So, and I got to tell you, when I did the risk assessment, I was really thinking about floods and tornadoes. I was not thinking that a pandemic would close the economy for 2 months. So, so this is a very unusual and unexpected event that has occurred for not only ourselves, but the entire country. And so all the local governments in the country are.
I agree. And certainly for the country as well as the world. So I totally agree with what you're saying. So thank you so much.
So, yes, so, I don't think we need to, harp on this, sales tax is very volatile. And so, there is some risk on relying on it too much. But there's also, there's all kinds of, well, there's risk in just relying on it. Oh, so actually it's 23% of the general fund revenues. And our reliance is greater now that we shifted 6 mills downward from the city general fund, and the reliance on sales tax increased since 2016 slightly. It was 21% in 2016. Also, there is some sensitivity to collection methods. The sales tax base could change, and then just generally the stock market impacts the economic conditions. It impacts consumer confidence. There's interest rate hikes by the Fed or reductions. There's, international trade disputes. So, a lot of things impact consumer confidence. So this goes to the question I think Commissioner Bryant was asking. So if we were to, given the COVID revenue impact, and if we did not change any of our budget, we would end up with a fund balance for the combined general fund of 9%. So that's how much lower it would go. Okay.
Kathleen, Commissioner Burrows again. The report from the state was that sales taxes were up 0.5 basis points more than what they anticipated. So I believe that goes to what you stated early on in your presentation, that the people stocked up. There are still people out there purchasing. You had your essential businesses that were utilizing sales. So the state itself has seen a 0.5 basis points increase in their sales tax when they were looking for a lot more, but still 0.5 basis point. So the challenge we have with the local property or local sales tax is just that. It's our local sales tax. But I truly believe that some of the things you talked about that could affect our sales tax, we may be immune from, but it can affect us. But I don't think that our sales tax is as dire as some of us might believe it is. At least that's not what the report is from the state that I received today.
Well, so it is real tempting to be hopeful, and but I think it's best to plan for the worst and hope for the best. So, but it is very tempting to be hopeful. Yeah. So yes, the base sales tax did perform okay in March. It did.
Through the end of May.
But April, all those businesses were closed, and we don't have information on April. So I don't know. We'll see.
Well, Kathleen, my report come in through the end of May that showed that, as I stated, the state, even though it was down overall from what they had projected, it had still performed 0.5 basis point above what they had anticipated after they came back and made the cuts. So, I mean, we're very fluid in all of this. I just wanted to share that with others. I'm reading the report at the same time I'm talking to you, and the state made cuts just like what we were proposing to do here, and found out that the cuts weren't needed as deep as they thought they would, which is a good sign. And this is through the end of May. So these are the latest numbers that came out today. I wanted to run those numbers before we had a chance to have this meeting tonight.
So those numbers from the state that you're talking about, they came out the end of May, but those for April transactions, right? And so they're basic. If I'm understanding you right, what you're saying is they're, 0.5% better than the reduced number that they revised for that month. Is that right?
That's correct. It says all those sales tax receipts for the month of May were 27.3 million less than those from the same month from 2019.
Oh,
The fiscal year to date receipts. Now, remember, their budget runs different than our budget. We run from, on the state side, it runs to the end of June, starts the 1st of July. We run through fiscal year. So, but this is for the forecast was reduced in April by 95 million, notwithstanding the fact that receipts through March had run 22.5 million above the previous estimate. So
right, through
it
March.
says sales tax receipts through the end of May continue to show positive growth of 0.6%. I said a half a basis point. I was being conservative, above the 2019 receipts.
All right, so if there aren't any more questions about that, I wanted to move on to the special revenue funds. So just as a reminder, we have a variety of special revenue funds, and the current policy, which we are going to be discussing a revision to this policy in the next agenda item. But the current policy basically delineates a range of target minimum reserves depending on the fund. And so, and it follows the same situation where, you know, if the minimum reserves are not met, then, you know, at some point, if we foresee that there's a problem, then we develop a plan to replenish and so forth. So I mean, that's the same provision as in the general fund. So I'm gonna talk about, there's 4 categories of these special revenue funds, and a lot of this presentation you have seen in prior years. So there's a lot of kind of legal jargon in here in some of these slides, and honestly, I just provided them as a means for you all to kind of refer to. I wasn't necessarily going to revisit each one of the legal provisions of each of these funds, but I'm providing it as a just, you know, for you as a reference.
And Kathleen, I appreciate that very much. I believe, as you stated, a number of the committee members have talked about these special funds.
So we have, we have the county levy funds, we have 2 debt service funds, and then we have funds that are restricted by state statutes, and then funds that are created by the unified government, have been created in the past and have some of, under the authority that the state statutes provide us. So, so the first one is the county levy funds, and generally we are granted home rule powers, you know, to counties in 1974, and so we can set up various property tax levies for various purposes, and these are the property tax levies that we currently have: the Developmental Disabilities Fund, the Election Fund, the Health Department Fund, the Mental Health Fund, and then the Aging Fund. And each of these have specific, you know, restrictions on how to spend the money, and so based on state statute. And here's the balances for the funds in this category. So each one of these categories, it's presented the same way. So the first column is, remember, it's the expenditures, it's not the fund balance, it's how much was spent during 2019, including transfers. And then the blue column is the fund balance at the end of 19. Now these are based on the CAFR. So these are the CAFR fund balances as prescribed in the policy. So then this next column is basically taking the fund balance and dividing it in by the expenditure level. And so you can see, like, for example, developmental disabilities, its fund balance of $479,000 is 110% of the amount it spent in 2019. So that's a pretty healthy fund balance. Whereas the current policy we have in place, as I mentioned, we have a range. And so it prescribes a minimum reserve of between 10 and 15%. And so this last column is how much in excess of the highest number it is. So if we only had 15% of the expenditures in a reserve, then this is how much more we have in excess of the 15%. So, and then these are the mill levy rates. And so you can see the Developmental Disabilities Fund has quite a bit of fund balance. The elections has quite a bit of fund balance. I should point out that elections, their costs kind of vary from one year to the next, depending on whether there's a general election. So sometimes they need to have a little bit more money because when that big presidential election happens, they often spend more money in that year. So, there's a little bit of variability for them. The health department is at 11%. Mental health is at 10%. And the aging or the special programs for the elderly is only at 3%. So.
And Kathleen, again, this is Commissioner Burrows speaking. The committee has discussed this. I'm really pleased you brought these forward because we've had much discussion in reference to the target reserve range in reference to these funds. But as you can see, we do have, even though the mill levy has been set for those particular funds, we do find 3 of them that the reserves are in the negative category. So I guess my comment would be, when we do the budget, do we give guidance as to what the mill levy should be on those? Or is that guidance given that we want to keep the mill levy the same and then the administrator takes and makes the mill levy adjustment?
So, what's missing from this presentation is how much we plan to spend in 20 and how much we plan to spend in 21. And of course, those amounts, plus how much is coming in, those amounts impact the reserve. But as part of the budget process, we individually look at each and every one of these funds, and we monitor whether the reserves are too low or too high, and we make adjustments accordingly. And what I mean by we, I mean that the county commissioner and in conjunction with, say, the election commissioner, we talk about whether the mill levy should be shifted among these funds slightly. And so so we're happy. So as I mentioned in this prior slide here, I wanted to tell you that these reserve levels are going to be incorporated as part of our discussion of the 2020 amended 21 proposed budget process. And so we're certainly going to be very closely watching the reserve levels to see whether there's opportunities for shifting mills around to in order to make sure that the programs that are being provided, that it makes sense, for example. So.
Kathleen, again, Commissioner Burrows, I sincerely appreciate that statement. This is something, since I have come on as the commissioner, that we have identified that our reserves are out of whack with our mill rate. And we sincerely need to give consideration to proposed mill rates to make sure that at the very least that we meet the policy in place. And we haven't done it with the 3 negative categories here on the 3 funds: the health department, mental health, and special programs for the elderly. So either we're not raising enough money or it's costing us more money. And we need to balance that out. As far as the excess in reserves, when it comes down to making sweeps or utilizing those funds for something else, we are mandated because of the mill rate to spend those dollars accordingly. So I did want to bring that to your attention. I wanted to make a public statement. That's something that many of us have talked about over the last couple of years, and we see it again tonight, that we are underwater in reserves on 3 of these funds, and 2 of the funds have a tremendous amount of money. So I just wanted to bring that to the committee's attention.
Well, I failed to share earlier that as part of the 2020 budget, we shifted 0.4 mils, maybe 0.04 mills out of the development. I'm not remembering exactly, but a small millage we shifted out of the developmental disabilities fund and into the health department fund. So, you know, that, and you all approved that as part of the 2020 budget. And at the moment, the administration is thinking about keeping that in place.
Yeah.
So that shift.
Yeah.
So
And
just
Kathleen, again, this is Commissioner Burrows. So just for transparency's sake, this goes back to my original question. We approved a standard mill levy when we approve our budget. I don't know who had come forward and talked about the moving the 0.5% or something around. I would like to have that disclosed when we're having our budget discussion, because in my opinion, that was a sweep when we pulled some money down. But that's just my opinion. But I want to watch those dollars. If we're pulling money out of the developmental disability fund at a 0.5% mill, and that mill went into something else, then we need to ensure that whatever monies are there for developmental disabilities, that it is spent properly and accordingly. That's what the mill levy was set to do. And to come in later, once those funds have been identified as being excess, which we as a committee members have done that, only to find out that they were shifted later once we approved the entire mill structure. I want to know who has the authority, once we approve the mills, to go in there and change those around to collect the excess dollars and revenues. I just don't believe that's transparent to the public, and I don't think it's fair to the disability group, the elections group, or any of those who have been taxed or have a mill levy rate associated to those particular entities, that those monies set idle and or grow in reserves only to be moved somewhere else without public discussion. That's my comment.
So the next budget presentation, we're going to be presenting what they call the maximum mill levy presentation. And in that presentation is when each of the mills for each fund are presented. And any shifting that is recommended by the administration would be presented at that time for the entire commission's comment and approval. So that and vote. So that's and that's coming up in the next few weeks. Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am.
This is Commissioner Townsend. I have my hand raised, but this is a little bit challenging for all of us.
It is, and please never hesitate to speak up. Please, Commissioner Townsend.
Well, before Ms. Von Atchen proceeds, I'd like to remain on this, what is this, slide 14, and get a really primary understanding of what we're saying here. For instance, let's look at the health department, mental health, special programs for elderly. If you look at the column in the blue, those are all positive numbers indicated. Those are the remaining balances in those funds. That's correct, Ms. Van Atchen?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, explain to me what we're saying about those balances. Again, when we look at the column that says fund balances in excess of highest reserve target. And if you look at the health department, you've got a negative 143,300 and what is that, $63. What are we saying about that number? That the ending balance should be at least that amount added to the 334,500 and some $2 that we have in there to be in a compliant state.
Yeah, so right now the policy prescribes or recommends that you keep between 10 and 15% of the expenditure level.
Mm-hmm.
And so right now you are this fund is within that because it's at 11%, which is between 10 and 15%.
Right.
Right? And so this is just an example here. If we were shooting for the high one, the 15%, then this fund reserve of 334,000 would need to be $143,000 higher in order to meet that 15% here.
Okay.
Can you
So,
see
okay.
my
So
cursor?
at the highest range, we're looking for the highest range.
Well, it's
The
just
highest percentage range.
just to give you an example. I mean, I could have picked the lowest as well. So,
okay. And one other thing, I wanted to go back to your slide before we go any further that showed the general fund combined total fund balance, where we see that nosedive of the fund balance going down to 9% if we do nothing else. When we're looking at that 20% in 2019, is that number inclusive only of the 2 months of ongoing operating expenses where we should be around 17%? Or does that 20 also take into account the 1 month of emergency reserves? So we really should be comparing that number to 25%.
yeah, well, so we hit the 2 month, which is 17%, and then any amount above 17 is going towards the extra month.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess what I'm saying is that, okay, we're saying we're 20, looking at 17 with the 3% being extra.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
So that extra equates to $7.7 million.
Okay. Well, I'm always going to be pretty careful from here on out to make sure that I fully understand if we're talking about the reserve when you quote a percentage, inclusive of or not inclusive of the emergency, which would be the 25% watermark.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we have Commissioner Johnson with his hand raised.
Please, Commissioner Johnson, thank you for your patience.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Kathleen, I have a pretty short attention span, for better or for worse, so I've jumped ahead throughout the presentation. And from what I can tell, these are the only 3 funds that have a fund balance less than what we have prescribed. And I'm speaking specifically the health department, mental health, and special programs for the elderly.
Actually, the only one is the elderly. Only the elderly. These other 2 are within the range. It's only elderly.
Yes, I stand corrected on that. So we only have 1 fund out of, I don't know how many funds you have in this presentation that is out of sync, so to speak. And the only question I have to that is, for that 1 fund, historically, has it been lower than what we have prescribed, or can you give me some historical context for this particular fund? Everything else, as I can tell, Chair, looks like they are at or above what we have prescribed, or the state has prescribed, or whoever has prescribed these particular percentages.
And Mr. Johnson, you're correct in that statement, but we also made a change in the policies last year that allowed some of those monies to be moved around for the technology fund and a few other things, which lowered and impacted some of those reserve funds. And my point all along has been, let's be transparent in the mill levy requirement that we're putting on it, because those mill levies reflect in our total mill levies that we assess our ratepayers. And so it's important that even though these are only 1.2 mills or 2.4 mills, it's important that we utilize that mill levy to pay for those services and not utilize them to build reserves. And our reserves that are set aside, are they inclusive of these reserves in reference to the 2 month that we're putting aside, or are they excluded? that's a discussion for us as a committee, but I really appreciate you bringing those out and looking at those. And I'd be more than happy to visit with you about some of the other discussions that have gone on in reference to these mill levy reserves.
No, I agree with you. Every meal counts right now in this environment. So I completely appreciate the scrutiny with which we have been applying to these funds, particularly what we are expecting right now and coming into the next year or two. Every fraction of a meal counts. So I appreciate the work that you and Commissioner Walters have already put into this. I don't need to be brought up to speed on it. I just want to make sure I was understanding this properly. And so I guess just back to my original question, historically on the special programs for elderly, has that typically been out of whack, Kathleen, or is this just a one-off situation?
The special programs for the elderly have a lot of needs. And so they pretty much, are always a little short. And in fact, every year we not only collect this property tax, but we also transfer $260,000 from the county general fund to this fund in order to augment the number of meals that we can, distribute to our aging population. So
with that being said, and again, I don't want to take too much time in the weeds. That's not where I really need to stay at. But does it make sense, back to what Commissioner Burrows has been talking about, for us to at least address those areas that are below the prescribed percentages, of which I see one right now, so that we don't have to continue continue that process of having to transfer funds over, when we might need to just make an adjustment in the fraction of whatever meal that we're assessing to that fund. That's the only thing I would add to the conversation.
That is one opportunity. I would like to also point out that developmental disabilities, generally they build within their budget expenditures that for unexpected kind of emergency needs. But they also often don't know exactly what the grant level is going to be for their services in the grant fund. And so what happens is their budget, for example, typically is around, let's say 550 or 550,000, or, maybe 600,000, but then they end up only spending 436,000. Because that emergency money that they planned for wasn't spent. And so that's how the reserves got started building in this fund, is because, some of the contingency money that they have to set aside wasn't needed. And so that's why, so just so you know, that's why this fund balance is higher.
Well, I appreciate that. There's always a narrative that comes with all of these percentages. Like I said, I'm always saying I'm a bottom line kind of guy, and I only see one fund right now that might need some adjustment. But other than that, it looks like everything else is at and or above where it has been prescribed, either by the state or by us or whomever other agencies might be. I'm talking about the other funds going forward that you're going to identify in this presentation. So I'm going to shut up so we can move on.
Well, no, I really appreciate your comments and questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner.
So there's the debt service fund is reported as one single fund in the CAFR, but in reality, there's a city general fund, or I'm sorry, a city debt service fund. It's the bond and interest fund, and then there's a county bond and interest fund. And then there's a whole variety, I think about 15 separate tax increment financing funds. So, but we're going to focus on the city and the county bond and interest fund. And you've seen some information, quite a bit of information about the financial performance of those two debt service funds as part of the CMIP presentation. So I'm not going to belabor that. But I did want to share this with you. So we have the City Bond and Interest Fund ending the fund balance with $6 million, and the county bond and interest with 4.5 million. And then all of the TIF debt service funds combined equal 4.1 million. So that's a total of $14 million. And all of these are like 100% restricted for debt service. So, and the state statutes are very clear on that. So if you want to spend this money, you have to issue debt and then pay off the debt with those reserves. So
Kathleen, are we able to on this excess funds, I'm sorry for not coming to Mr. Chair, forgive me for that, Chairman Burrows.
Go right ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you. The 8.8 million, are we achieving any kind of positive arbitrage on those funds, since we are obligated to keep them in the fund and not able to spend them? Can you speak to that, and any other of the other funds as well to that degree? Are we able to receive a positive arbitrage on those since we can't use them for debt service?
Yeah, we have a we have a policy, an internal accounting policy related to which funds receive interest income, and these funds do receive interest income on their balances, if that's what you're asking. Yeah. So I wanted to mention, so the county bond and interest fund, the reason its fund balance is higher is because we, or all of you approved as part of the budget the past 2 years. I think that began in 17 and in 18 and again now in 19. We transferred roughly between $1 and $1.5 million amongst those years, each of those years, from the county general fund to this county bond and interest fund, in anticipation of the debt service that we're going to be paying for the juvenile center. So the debt service on the juvenile center is about $1.7 million. And so that was something that we did in order to kind of set aside money in the county bond and interest fund to make sure that we had enough to make that heavy debt service payment. So that's why that fund balance is higher. Okay. The TIF debt service funds are basically there's debt service well, basically sales tax and property tax over the course of the life of the tax increment financing district exceeded the amount of debt service that was required. And so there's a number of funds in there. And so that's what that is. All right. And so as the bonds become callable, then we're able to pay off those TIFs earlier with those reserves. Now the city bond and interest fund, it's holding $6 million, mainly, as I mentioned during the CMIP presentation, because over the course of especially the last 5 years, we have refinanced bonds, a number of bonds. Every year we refinance bonds so that the debt service is less than what we were paying previously. But then also when we permanently finance bonds, sometimes we overestimate how much is left for the project cost, and the costs end up being a little less than what we bonded for. And so the difference in those proceeds are required to be deposited back from the project account to the debt service account, so that those balances have been growing. And so that's why that 6 million is in there. Now, as you know, these funds don't necessarily need a great deal of liquidity. And that's because we have set mills in place. Well, the TIF probably needs some liquidity, all right? But the city and the county bond and interest fund, they probably don't need very much liquidity, because we receive 1/2 of the property tax payment at the first month of the year. So, and the first debt service payment made in February is for interest, not principal. So the larger debt service payment happens typically in October for principal and interest. So just so you know. All right. Any questions on that? So those Commissioner Burrows mentioned the county technology funds. By statute, we have 3 of them set up for the clerk, the register of deeds, and the treasurers. And they're restricted for these purposes that are discussed here. I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but generally they're for acquiring equipment and technology services. And there is some provision for the use of the balances in these funds once they exceed $50,000, but the balances, the use of those balances have to be authorized by the respective people in charge of these funds. So the UG clerk, the elected register of deeds, and then the county treasurer. So, the court trustee is restricted for the use of supplies and some furniture suitable for the court trustee office, but also to assist families and children with child support enforcement. We have a 911 fund. It's a fee per prescriber on accounts and telephone numbers, and it's very restricted. You can only use the money for these purposes. You can't even put operating or personnel in here. We have the special alcohol fund and the special parks and recreation fund, and this is the revenue from these funds are from the sale of alcohol at clubs and drinking establishments, but not liquor stores. And the purpose of those funds are specified here. And then the special highway fund is a gas tax fund, and this fund was negatively impacted due to COVID. And it's basically restricted for construction and reconstruction, alteration of city streets and highways. So here's the balances. And so the jail commissary fund is, if you do the math, it has a significant percentage compared with its expenditures, but that's because the expenditures are so low. They were only $2,000 last year. So there's some excess revenue in there. These are the funds created by the UG Commission. I think I got this turned around.
Yeah, something's not adding up there, Kathleen.
You show the actual balances ahead of the description of the funds themselves. So,
Kathleen, the last slide that you have in the PowerPoint, I think, has the funds that you just went over.
Oh,
slide 28.
It got turned around. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah. All right. Sorry about that. Somehow the slide got well, let's go back to that slide then. So since we talked about it, sorry about that. All right, so here's the technology fund, and all the 3 technology funds are here. The county clerk, she's accumulating resources for future acquisition and software. She does plan to have some to engage in some projects in the coming years, so you'll see that as part of the budget process. The treasurer made a significant investment this year in the technology needs of the motor vehicle registration and property tax administration areas. So he spent down his fund balances, although they're still at 97%. The court trustee is administered by the courts, and so anyway, here's all the balances here.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Johnson has his hand raised.
Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Johnson?
Yeah, I think I might have gotten a little confused here, but I guess what I'm trying to understand, and I'm just looking at the one that you talked about, the county technology funds. And I think Commissioner Burrows, you may have already spoken to this. It sounds like there is some level of discretion that can be utilized for that particular fund if it is in excess of $50,000 above what it needs to be, or whatever the case may be. Is that true? I mean, I know it's true. I guess wanted your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah. Yeah.
And this, Commissioner Johnson, I appreciate you raising that question. And it's not to make accusations or to negatively point in any one special direction, but those funds are there for specific reasons. And either they're not being spent to address those reasons, or they're sitting there and accumulating a large reserve. And we do know that technology is not cheap. But if we're sitting at, as you can see, the one at the top, 6,800% of reserves, we should have a report as to why those reserves have grown to the extent that they have. And what I would caution us about doing is seeing those reserves grow and then see them diminish with no expense put into the county clerk technology. So ideally sweeping those funds to go somewhere else in the budget. And we need to be mindful that funds that are restricted by Kansas statute, as Kathleen has stated, if they're just being set into reserves and not being spent, what services are we not providing? And what is our timeline to update the county clerk's technology to ensure that we can be more efficient and more effective in dealing with the needs of the county clerk? And if the reserves are too much, then we need to look at some of the costs of the county clerk. And that's just one example. As you can see, you have a number of them there with a 46% at the bottom. And we can talk about these. This is something that members of the Finance Committee have been trying to bring forward in the past. There's a tremendous amount of reserves sitting here. And either they're, as I stated, either they should be utilized for what they are designated for, or we need an explainer to us as to why they continue to sit there within the budget in the reserves. That's just my point to the committee and its members.
And I would add a question to that extent as well. Are these funds receiving, are these excess funds receiving interest also, Kathleen?
Some of these funds receive interest, but not all of them. No, it's based on our accounting policy, and the accounting policy follows the state statute. We only give interest to funds that are where we're required. The rest of the interest goes to the county or the city general funds.
So hold on. So that's to say that all the funds are receiving interest. Some of the interest is going to the general fund.
Yes.
Okay, just want to make
sure. So these technology funds aren't receiving interest.
None at all?
It's not statutorily required, yeah.
But just because it's not statutorily required doesn't mean that we shouldn't be acquiring or putting them into interest-bearing accounts though, right?
Well, we invest all of our reserves. It's just that the interest is allocated to either the county, in this instance, the county general fund instead of the fund.
Okay, that's what I want to make sure. So they're all receiving interest.
Yeah.
It just comes down to the matter of whether or not they're required to go into the general fund or not.
Right.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
I think I need to hop back forward to this here, right? Okay, so, all right, so the next category is that right? Is that the next category? Because I'm getting confused now. Right.
Kathleen, I think what you've been able to propose this evening, a majority of the committee has had a chance to review the documentation. Might I suggest, are there any questions of Kathleen in reference to any of the materials that were received or put forward? I do know that we have two other items that are action items this evening, and I don't want to take away from our time to address those. But I, as chair, I would ask the committee if there's anything pressing through these numbers that you might have any questions in reference to.
I'm good, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chair.
My questions have been answered.
I would like to mention, Chair, that as part of the upcoming budget workshop, we'll be presenting to you the status of all of those funds and the fund balance that we're projecting through 2021, so you can see what the plan is.
And the committee will be most appreciative of that, Kathleen. Thank you. Look forward to seeing what those proposals are in reference to not only the mill rate, but how the reserve funds will be utilized and or stipulated as to how they shall be utilized. And I know some of them are follow under ordinances, statute. We will address those through the budget process. So if I may, committee, are there any other questions? Commissioner Walters, Commissioner McKiernan?
I'm good.
Okay. Kathleen, thank you very much for your presentation. Should you have any questions, committee, please don't hesitate to reach out to Kathleen and or to other members of the commission to have any of those questions or any of the concerns you might have. Be mindful those calls need to be limited to a very small group, but Kathleen and staff are there to help with any questions you may have. I look forward to having that discussion during the budget process. With that, Kathleen, I'd like to move on to item number 2. That was for information only. Item number 1, as I stated early on. Item number 2 is a revision of the financial policies. And so that will take an action statement. So Kathleen, if you want to guide us through that one, item number 2.
Yes, so I don't have a PowerPoint for that one. So I've presented as part of the packet the draft of 2 policies that for your consideration, as well as resolutions to adopt those policy revisions. So the first one has to do with the very subject that we were just talking about, which is the special revenue funds. So, and basically the only change presented in the draft that you have in front of you is that we would actually change, the range, because right now the current policy has a range as the minimum reserve is a range, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me and to some of us. We think that if you have a minimum, it should be a minimum, percent. And we had a number of conversations about that and what we, individually, and what we, many of us concluded that in order to be consistent, we should just keep them at between, many of them at 2 months, similar to the general fund. The second, and then the other item that I added to the policy was a reference to the actual statutory requirements and restrictions of those various funds. So there's a lot in there to talk about, and we're already getting kind of late in the evening. So I don't know. The second policy that I have in front of you is to have you approve the revisions to the capital asset policy. And that policy was already approved by the Public Works Commission. And so this is what you need to do. Basically it's formalizing the provisions for you.
Commissioner Burrows, Commissioner Townsend has a question.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Townsend, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Von Atchen, I think you answered one of the questions I had already, and that was with respect to the move from the range of percentages to 2 months. And that was chosen to be consistent with how we're looking at the fund balance expenditures.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
All right, so I did have a question about something that was not proposed as a change. And it appears, I don't know what page this is, but it's item G in the policy, and it talks about fund balance classification. And in it, the policy talks about in what order we could reduce restricted fund balances and or unrestricted fund balances if such a need arose. And as I'm reading it, I was confused as to why we're saying in the policy that we could reduce restricted fund balances first, followed by unrestricted fund balances. You lost me there because we spent quite a bit of time and explanation talking about the restrictions on some of these funds, and why would we, if we had to, reduce restricted fund balances first?
Yeah, so those that language was in the original policy that was adopted, and actually what it's saying is that it's important to spend the funds on the resources on expenditures for which it was, restricted for. That's what that's meaning. And so if there are any monies beyond that, then, if there are expenditures that are not specifically specified in the fund that are specifically for which it's specifically restricted, then you would spend that last. So it's an accounting. It's a good question. I would need to study it again because I'm forgetting now why that was in there. So.
Okay, yeah, I'd appreciate some more clarity on that, because as you read through the policy, if we were in a position where we were looking to go to some reserve fund for extra money, it just seems to me the plain language of this, as I read it, was saying we can go and look at the restricted funds first and then go to the unrestricted. To me, it just seems like it would be exactly the opposite. And it goes to what I think the point Mr. Chairman was making, that we want to give services or use the money, but it seems like we should be using unrestricted first.
Well, so it's actually not applicable with most of these funds because all of these funds already have 100% restriction, is my point. So that statement is applicable to, funds that, for example, in the general fund, there's a number of revenues that are specifically restricted and others that are not. But these funds that you're looking at, well, special asset fund is not restricted at all. So anyway.
Well, I wasn't particularly.
I'll get back to you.
At any of them. I'm just looking at the language here that says we go to restricted funds first and then to unrestricted fund balance. And it just on the face of it didn't make sense to me at all. So if you could look at it later and further clarify, I would appreciate it, just so I understand that better. Thank you.
Any other commissioners?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and if you can provide that explanation to the whole committee, I'd be interested on that as well.
Okay.
And Kathleen, I appreciate you sending these changes out. But if you remember correctly, when we proposed the changes a couple of years ago, the committee took a tremendous amount of time and energy and effort to address these concerns and the policy changes in our financials. And so tonight, I would highly recommend that committee members look over those policy positions. Kathleen, I just want to state this is an action item. There's been some questions raised. My question to you is, do you want this, do you want to go ahead and take a vote on this evening with the questions that are there? Commissioners, is that what you want to do? If that's what you want to do, we'll go ahead and take the vote. I anticipate this is going to be a point of discussion come budget.
Hey, I would recommend that we table this for next month, but given the hour.
Okay. Any other comments from the commission?
This is Commissioner Townsend. I agree with Ms. Von Atchen's recommendation only because we as this committee need some clarity on what it is that's actually going forward before we vote. At least that's my view. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to ask guidance from staff. Staff, is what action do we need to take to table this evening?
So, Commissioner, I think just a motion to table for 1 month.
Thank you for that guidance. So with that, I would entertain a motion to table till next month.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. This is Commissioner Townsend. I so move table this item from 1 month to the next meeting of this body. Thank you.
Second from Johnson.
Okay. There has been a motion and a second. Any comments from the commission before we take a vote? Staff, do I need to ask the public if there's any comments, being this is a table?
Yes, since it's an action item, we'll go ahead and see if there were any public, anyone wanting to comment.
Thank you. Staff, did we have anyone stepping forward or presenting information?
No request was submitted to the clerk's office regarding this item.
Thank you. Let the record show no one came forward. With that, we have a motion and a second on the table to table for 30 days. I would ask the clerk to please call roll.
Roll call: Bryant.
Aye.
Walters.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Townsend.
Aye.
McKiernan.
Aye.
Burrows.
Aye. Thank you, committee. I think that was the prudent thing to do. And Kathleen, thank you for your patience with us. These are important items, and I really commend the commissioners for taking them seriously. Item number 3 is the NRA plan. Our last item for this evening is the 21 through 25 NRA plan revisions. Again, I would like to thank everyone for their participation early on. I will now recognize Catherine Carter, who will be joining us and giving our presentation this evening.
All right, good evening. Can everyone see my screen? Yes? Excellent. Okay. We will be, there's a decent amount of information to go through, but we will try to be pretty expeditious in our kind of going through this, knowing that it is already 7:40, so it's been an evening already for you all. There we go. Just kind of a quick update on what this is every 3 years we go through and have the neighborhood revitalization plan kind of revised and then reapproved by all the different taxing jurisdictions. So today, just kind of making sure from the jump, today is not for approval. This is really for you all to see the improvements we think that we will be taking to the other taxing jurisdictions and making sure that kind of we have your kind of tacit approval or your kind of approval in concept. And then once we speak with the other taxing jurisdictions, we will come back and get request formal approval from you all. So if that works, we will get moving. Stephanie Moore in Economic Development will also be assisting. She manages this program on a day-to-day basis and will be presenting with me. So Stephanie.
Thank you, Catherine. Stephanie Moore, Management Analyst, Economic Development. So Commissioner, some of this may look familiar to you. As we recall, we presented some of this with the Finance Committee a few weeks ago. So like Catherine said, it is time to renew the program. The NRA started 20 years ago, actually, so it's been around a while. It's a very successful program in promoting and revitalizing Kansas City, Kansas through new construction and rehab. And we are asking for jurisdictions to approve it so that we can be the ones to approve projects and they don't have to re-come to all the jurisdictions. And it's just an easier and faster way to get those projects rolling.
Yeah, you know, this is one of those projects, and we'll get into more of the nitty gritty here in a minute, but this really is one of those programs and tools that we have that is able to really focus on those smaller projects. This is not one where you're going to need, you know, to pay for a development attorney and all of that. This is a program that, you know, someone, your neighbor can, or you can use if you're kind of rehabbing your home or business. So this is really meant to be a very user-friendly program. So this is for the folks out watching on UGTV or on YouTube, just kind of a quick kind of explanation of how this tool works. So it's for residential and commercial. And what it does is it actually refunds the property tax on the increase of your property taxes due to whatever improvement you put into that property. So I always like to have a graphic. Sometimes it helps folks. So if you think about your property today, you know, there's kind of a base value. That's the property tax that you pay today is that blue kind of base value. So that's, you know, before you've done anything to it. Then you make some improvements to be qualified for this program. You have to have an increase of 15% of appraised value. So it's not a huge amount, but it's enough that, you know, you've really made some significant improvements on your property. So basically that piece that is in that orange color, that is what the increase of your property tax due to whatever improvement you made to your property. And you can see that that's for 10 years. And during that time, when you pay your taxes, so you have to pay your taxes every year, but then that additional amount will get refunded to you. So you'll get a check back for that amount. So we as the UG and the other taxing jurisdictions are not, we are not losing any money in this. You know, the goal of this is to have long-term growth and encourage people to invest in their properties. And so after 10 years, you can see the increment and the base value, all of that would come to the taxing jurisdiction. So hopefully, you know, if you're going to be investing in your property, you would keep doing so. And so we're really looking for long-term good, you know, good residents and folks who are going to keep their properties up.
So here's some examples showing investment in our community versus abandonment. It's really like the but-for test to make projects, especially commercial projects, passing that but-for project or test to get them and make them possible. So here's some great examples of residential rehab in there. Well, this is area 1, these are located. And then next slide is new construction. So you can see those infills happening. So those are excellent examples. And then this is a commercial rehab. So that's over in Fairfax. And this one is a new construction. So it's helping small businesses able to continue to invest in our community, and also helps out tremendously with residential and new construction projects for just single like residents working on their homes. And then here's just a breakdown of the active NRA projects. We have 312 going on right now. And that's just the breakdown of the 260, and residential is 52. So the one that I think stands out a lot here is that pre-construction appraised value of the 42 versus you get 3 times your bang for your buck on that post-construction value. So it's doing what it's intended to do, and it's a great program for the community.
So this chart just kind of breaks it down a little more, looking at kind of breaking out the commercial versus residential and really what that translates to in terms of tax value. So as you can see, commercial properties obviously taxed at a bit of a higher rate. We're looking at, if the folks who applied for the NRA, if they had done nothing to their properties, we'd be getting about 1,200,000 a year out of taxes. But now as they are starting to roll off, and that's another thing. So this is kind of a snapshot of all the active projects, but every year we have projects rolling off. So this is a kind of a moving target. And every year we're getting additional, more of these projects are coming on to the tax rolls at their full capacity. So you can see that what is estimated that once these projects are all off of the NRA, then we'll have over $3 million. So, I mean, it's a fairly significant number. And then as you can see with the total to go from about $1.5 million, which is, not nothing, but we'd certainly prefer over $4 million coming in taxes. And again, I just want to reiterate that this is a program that we're really trying to, really try to target those folks that may not make these improvements in their properties otherwise, and that by adding this rebate, that is the thing that actually gets them to invest and to make that continued revitalization in their neighborhoods.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Townsend has her hand raised.
Thank you. Commissioner Townsend, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Ms. Carter, Ms. Moore. Before we get too far gone with this, is this available to any property owner throughout the city or county? Are they eligible to get this tax increment benefit for improvement to their property, or does the property have to be located within a certain region in the city or county?
Well, it's like you're just teeing me up for the next slide, Commissioner.
Oh, okay.
Commissioner Walters has the time.
Yeah, so we'll get in, and there are actually a few changes that we are going to recommend to this. But really, this project started, or this program started in that area 1, so kind of your east of 635, roughly. The real goal again is revitalization. So really trying to target different areas. So in that area 1, this is eligible for 10. Properties are eligible for 10 years. And you can get a 95% rebate on that increment. Now, as you get into the green section, area 2, it goes down a little. So it's about 5 years and still the 95% rebate. And then there are some different, kind of these different corridors or kind of special areas. It's a fairly complex program, and one of the things we are trying to do is make it a little more user-friendly. So currently, it is the entirety of KCK. Now, we did receive an opinion from the Attorney General that actually says that we are in violation and that the neighborhood revitalization plan cannot cover the entire municipality. So we are going to be recommending removal of parts of the city for kind of this next phase of the plan. But as you can see, it is a project that, program that is heavily used in that area 1, a little less in area 2. We have not received a single application in area 3 or area 4. Bonner Springs and I believe Edwardsville also have their own plans, so they have their own requirements, and it's a little different, similar but a little different. So did that answer your question?
Well, yes, but it raises another one with your last comment about that some entity has declared we were not in compliance with the plan. So as we look at the plan that's on the screen now, is the schematic we see now in violation of any NRA requirements?
So yeah, it is the Attorney General's office that gives us the authority, and Wendy or Patrick, jump in if I'm misstating anything. But
Yeah, Catherine.
Yeah.
I would just say it's not that they declared we were in violation. The AG's office said that it's their opinion that municipalities should not cover their entire jurisdiction, just because the plan really wasn't intended to do that, and you're really looking at areas that need it the most. So to declare that your entire municipality is in need of this plan just wasn't what the statute was intended for. The AG's office did approve. They've always approved each plan, and we send it for their approval. But it was their opinion in the last time around that we should remove some portion and reduce the area. But we've always gotten AG approval on the plans.
Counselor, are we talking about state AG, or are we talking about US?
State, yes, the state attorney general's office signs off after we approve the interlocals.
So the plan as it's shown on the screen would be within their recommended suggestions or outside of it?
I'll let Catherine, can you talk about it? Is this the old map or the current?
Yeah, this is what is currently in place. So this is the plan that will expire at the end of 2020. So as we go, we're going to head into our recommendations here now, and we'll show you what we're recommending that we do moving forward.
Thank you.
Commissioner Townsend, I appreciate you bringing that issue forward. I don't want it to be confusing, because this is an item that we can absolutely use to encourage people to invest in our community. We just want to make sure that we, one, can comply, and two, that it sets out to do what we anticipate it can do. So I appreciate you bringing that question forward. Are there any other questions before we move on? Seeing none. Ladies, please.
All right, so now we are going to jump into kind of the handful of recommendations that we are proposing that we hope will make this a more effective as well as user-friendly program.
Yes. So right now the renewal term is 3 years, and I'd like to increase that to 5 years. The staff time in multiple departments is quite excessive, as it's a 12-month process to get it all the way through the system. So if we could save some time on that, make a good plan that's worth that 5-year time frame. So that's my first recommendation.
Our next recommendation, one of the changes that was made, I believe in the last one, it may be been in there a couple plans, I'm not entirely sure, but that it actually made in Project Area 1, so again, that is the most eastern part of our city, it allowed for some amount of NRA eligibility in TIF districts. Now, the issue with this is that you're using the same increment. So you're using the same the same increase in property tax. So you can't actually use both tools as intended. So what was approved in a previous plan was that in order to kind of, I think this was primarily after the previous downturn at the end of the last decade, that trying to get additional development in areas that a TIF district was put in place, and there was a the desired development did not happen. So adding an NRA, kind of hoping that would kind of move forward. The problem with this is that we are taking to pay those rebates for the NRA that's coming directly out of our general fund. And it's been utilized a couple times, but in our opinion, not enough to justify having it as a part of our policy. The next one is currently the NRA rebates are calculated kind of based on market fluctuation. So whatever, you have that base set, and then whatever is increasing over the course of that 10 years or 5 years, depending on the term, that is the amount that is rebated. What our appraiser and our treasurer's office have suggested, and I believe what a number of other municipalities do in our state, is actually put it kind of make a fixed percent. So it really is based on what those improvements made. So what that would look like is, you have your base, you make the improvements, the appraiser goes out, sees what the new value is, and then that's the amount that you will be rebated for the next 10 years. This has, what we've understood is that was actually the original kind of idea for the program, and it would also assist in kind of having to manually go in and override for our treasurer's department.
Kathleen, if I may, and Stephanie, please don't hesitate to chime in. Again, this is Commissioner Burrows. Just what you had stated, do we have criteria set forth in this policy that would limit commercial percentages versus residential percentages, so that we wouldn't, if we were to set a capital investment of hypothetically $1 million of monies available through tax incentives, and a commercial projects came in and took advantage of those, and we wouldn't be able to allow the residential to bust that cap. Do we have something in place or consideration as to setting a cap as to how much residential can use and how much commercial can use, or a percentage of that cap, so that everyone has a fair opportunity to receive the monies necessary to invest in their projects?
So at this time, we don't have a cap. It is, we have a cap in terms of the size of project. So it has to be, basically under a $3 million project. There are some some outliers, but those would have to come in front of the commission and kind of go through a full process. Because most of these are very small projects, we have not felt the need to put some kind of cap on this. I think that if, for example, going back to the last one, if that were something that you all were interested in retaining, then I could see potentially putting some kind of cap, since this is directly coming out of the general fund. But otherwise, we have not considered that.
Thank you for that. The purpose of asking that question was budget stability moving forward. And that's why I wanted to present that. But thank you for that comment.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Catherine, this is Commissioner McKiernan. If I could just jump in here real quick with a question. Historically, have we recalculated the increment every tax year and taken, let's say, 90% of that new calculation? So it's been a fluctuating increment.
Yeah.
And now we're proposing that at the time that the NRA is executed, we will assess on that value, and that's the rebate that will apply for the life of that particular NRA.
That's correct.
I like that. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Stephanie.
Okay, so as you recall from the map that Commissioner Townsend pointed out, Area 2 is quite complex and confusing. I don't know if you guys saw, we have Area 2, Area East, West, and it's in, we have Turner and USD 500 in that area. So we're proposing to simplify Area 2 and just make one Area 2. So getting rid of that to West, to East, and just keeping it and having it mirror everything. So it's simpler to understand, easier to administer, and less confusing. And even our legislative auditor noted the complexity of our program and suggested simplification. So that's one of our other suggestions.
Stephanie, this is BPU board member Jeff Bryant. So does that also mean we would kind of roll in the State Avenue corridors and the Leavenworth Road corridors?
Those those are considered special project areas within the plan, and there's commercial development. So those are to spur commercial development along those corridors.
Yeah, so the thought would be to continue to have those be special areas where we're trying to kind of get additional development, particularly commercial.
So it'd be more that pinkish purple to the left. Yeah. And then Turner, it's not really designated on here, but Turner has their own standalone requirements. So we're going to ask them to mirror the rest of Area 2. So as the slide, so it still be then 5 years, the 95%. And right now, Turner does not allow for rehab. So we're trying to allow for that and also remove that threshold. They had a minimum threshold of 175,000 for new construction. So we'd like to get rid of that, you know, costs increase, decrease. So we want to kind of make it user friendly for the next 5 years. And then this is one that I have a lot of experience with. What people don't find out about our program until they're polling their application or right after they've started, which makes them ineligible currently. So we're trying to give them that 30-day leeway to give them some time to submit their application and increase participation in that way as well.
And Stephanie, Commissioner Burrows, I truly appreciate that. I think it's part of the education, transparent part of our programs that we put forward. Anything that we can do to ensure that our public knows what offers are available to assist them in rehabbing or building or remodeling, I think is a very, very good point to start with.
Yeah, this is one that I have a lot of experience with. So I don't like telling people no, they can't participate. So right. Really want to get more participation.
I commend you for that.
Thank you.
All right, the next one is could be one of the more controversial ones. So at the moment, the only multifamily that is eligible is rehabilitation of multifamily. You can do new construction if it's a duplex, but that's the extent of multifamily new construction. And the problem that we've run across is that, again, we're talking about small projects. This is not your behemoth 100+ units. We're talking about your 6plexes, your 4plexes. And when we are wanting to add additional density into our community, there are areas where it does make sense to have mixed use as well as multifamily in these areas. And at the moment, there is nothing we can provide. So we have basically zero tools that would help us encourage, you know, high quality multifamily of that kind of size. So this is one that I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on. But again, you know, we're talking about kind of very community kind of scale multifamily. This would be in areas that is, you know, zoned correctly. They would have to go through that whole process. This does not allow them to get through that. And it would additionally, we are still keeping the single family requirement that they have to be owner occupied. So, so we feel like we've hopefully reached kind of a balance where we can keep everyone happy and still allow for new quality development to increase density.
Any questions?
No questions, but from my point of view, I think that this is appropriate given the total cap we still have on the price, given the fact that single family is still supposed to be owner occupied, that it would help us with, as you said, those 4 and 6plexes, for example, that would fit under the $3 million cap, but allow us to build some gradual density. I like it.
Great, thank you.
Fine point, Commissioner. Ladies, anything else?
We have one more.
Okay.
All right, circling back to the map from earlier and what we were talking about, the Attorney General and the state statute not allowing the whole area to have the eligibility. So we're suggesting to remove areas 3 and 4, since there is no active NRAs in those areas. There's no participation at all. So those would be the western portions of the county. So we're moving those so we can be in compliance, and the Attorney General will like our plan this year.
So Stephanie, this is Jeff Bryant. Over the life of this program, have there been any projects in area 3 and 4?
I would have to look back to see first when we added 3 and 4 into the mix, and if we've had any. I can look back at the expired ones. I'd have to do some research on that.
My guess is, I don't know about area 3. I'm not sure when that one was added, but area 4 was is a fairly recent, certainly within the last 10 years addition. And this map is showing what is active, which means the last 10 years. So I think it is unlikely we've had any projects in that area.
Yeah, Stephanie, don't waste your time on it.
I have a comment. We just added Area 3 very recently. It was at the request of the city of Edwardsville, so that the entire city of Edwardsville would have consistency. Area 3, as I understand it, expanded the NRA requirements or opportunities that Edwardsville has adopted for their city into what we're calling Area 3, which I think we just did that within the last 24 months.
Yeah, it's possible that was a, yeah, or likely that was an addition in that last plan. So yeah, as you can see on this map, so here's the Edwardsville line, or well, here's the Edwardsville line, but yeah, this is, well.
It was with, I think it was to do with the school district boundaries versus the Edwardsville city limits. Exactly. So I think before we change that, somebody needs to do some research.
Okay.
Commissioner Townsend has a question.
Please, Commissioner Townsend.
My only concern, I guess, and I just need a better understanding of it, was the proposal to remove NRA eligibility in TIF districts. And I'm thinking back to probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I toured some of the new houses in the Douglas Sumner district off of 7th and Oakland, around that area. And I distinctly recalling that the real estate agent who was showing me the property made mention of the fact that those homes would qualify for this NRA tax advantage. I'm not sure if a TIF was developed there. And where I was going with this is it's one less tool to make development attractive. So I really want to understand why, again, you're proposing we not do this. I don't know. I think this was prior to Commissioner Johnson's time, but I would certainly appreciate his chiming in if he's aware of the projects that I'm talking about was TIF'd, or any of the other commissioners know.
Yeah,
that was my only concern with that recommendation.
Okay. Yeah, there's not a TIF in the Douglas Sumner area. There is a TIF in the St. Peter's Waterway. That might be another spot that I know they have utilized this. So, you know, our real concern is just the constant layering of tools. So while it is helpful, so in Project Area 1, that's the only area that a TIF and an NRA can coexist. What the current plan says is that you would be eligible for 5 years. So our real concern is that comes directly out of the general fund. And, you know, it's been unclear if that's been a real catalyst to actually encourage, you know, development or revital, you know, actually putting, you know, additional work into your house. Because again, you're looking at a TIF and an NRA they're both feeding off of the same funding. So it's both coming off of the property tax. So so technically it is, you can't have an NRA and a TIF, but for our agreement in previous years, pay that out of the general fund. So you are allowed.
And we're talking about new builds as well as rehabs, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, again, my only caveat or concern is that in that area one for the NRA, it seems like we'd want to use whatever we could to spur new development or improvement. That's my only concern. It seems like we would want to keep whatever incentives we had instead of removing them, but
Commissioner McKiernan has his hand raised, Chair.
Please, Commissioner McKiernan.
Thank you so much. So playing a little bit off of Commissioner Townsend's comments here and going to the whole TIF NRA, I completely get it. It is the same increment. And don't we run the risk, Catherine, that if we layer a TIF and an NRA, so the NRA gives a 90% abatement, there's only 10% of that increment left. If you TIF that out, then we get 0 increment into our general fund for the provision of basic city and county services in that area. Isn't that a possibility?
I would go a step further and say that we're basically paying them. So the full increment, the TIF is first. So the TIF, depending, most of these TIFs, most of the residential TIFs are 100%. So these TIFs take the entire 100% of the increment, and then to pay back, to do that rebate, that is 100% from the general fund. So we are actually spending money, which again, this is a policy decision. So we are just laying out the facts, but want to make sure that that's understood, that, you know, this is money coming from the general fund.
So that's even more aggressive than I thought, where the NRA rebate then comes on top of a 100% abatement for the TIF. And something like, I would suggest that we not have NRA and TIF coexist. That would be my thought on this, because I do think that even though we want to incent new development and we want to encourage new development, we also need, as a unified government, to have every new development contribute at least a little something more to our general funds so that we can provide the additional layer or level of city and county services that are going to be required to support that new development. So even if it's only 10%, if we have a 90% NRA for 10 years, at least that project is paying 10% more. And it is contributing to a higher level of provision of city services. So that's just my position on that.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Commissioner McKiernan has made me think about this in a different way. So I appreciate that. But is there possible then that on maybe new development or on rehab, one or the other, you don't do the layering? Would that make sense?
Mr. Chair, Patrick Walters has his hand raised.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to suggest.
Please.
Thank you. I was just going to suggest, if we do want to continue some type of incentive program for properties within a TIF, I think we should look at structuring a separate economic program, because I just don't think it's really even accurate to say that that falls within the NRA, because as Catherine explained, that we've already taken that increment. So it's really almost a fiction to say that it's an NRA the same way that these other properties are. So we could look at some type of separate incentive program, but I just think legally and just factually to say, because like Catherine said, that money's already been taken. So to dip into the general fund, we're really kind of creating our own a new incentive program. I think it'd be better just to call it something different.
I appreciate that information, Jamal. Thank you.
Commissioner Walters has his hand raised, Commissioner.
Yes, Commissioner, please.
Thank you. The more I think about this, I'm still struggling a little bit with Area 3. And I understand Area 4 may not need incentives, and it's been in existence for a long time and there haven't been any applications. Area 3 is completely different in my opinion. It is probably an area that could use incentives to foster development. As I said, it's fairly new, so I don't know why there haven't been any applications, but I would really recommend that we not remove Area 3.
Commissioner, I don't disagree with Commissioner Burrows. I don't disagree with that statement. I think what we're getting an opportunity to do this evening is to hear any proposals, to raise any questions we may have, and ask and advise staff to go back and review some of the recommendations and discussions that we've had. I do have a point of clarity, and either it be legal or Catherine or Stephanie can respond. When we talk about the 90% that we abate, is that involve our school districts, our libraries, and our community college, all those other taxing entities? Are they getting their portion from us on that 90%, or are they getting monies from us, from our general fund, to make up for that difference?
No, so basically the process, this kind of approval process that we do every 3 or hopefully 5 years, is to talk to you all, get the Unified Government Commission's approval. So that kind of approves your piece of the city county piece of the puzzle. And then, you know, Stephanie and I are going to go on a road show here and go speak with USD 500, USD 202. If, as Commissioner Walters has suggested, we add that additional spot, we will go speak with USD 204, as well as KCK Community College. And we actually get interlocal agreements for each of their pieces of the puzzle, you know, of that tax, so that then, you know, they're basically giving the UG authority to, you know, in these very specific situations outlined in this plan, to give away kind of their portion of their taxes.
Understood. I think it was important that the community hear about that also, because those entities do have invested interest in our community and the development of our community. However, they also have a vested interest in the revenue that they're foregoing to ensure that that development may occur. So I think it's important that those entities be included, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. Thank you.
Thank you. And we encourage any of you who are interested to join us at any of these meetings. You know, I think it should be some lively discussion, and at some of them, others maybe not, but it's always a good time to go see what the other taxing jurisdictions are up to.
Are there any other questions? I know this was for information only. I do want to ask, were there any questions from the public in reference to tonight's presentation on this item?
The public did not submit any request.
Okay, thank you. Ladies, anything else you want to say before we close?
That is it. We appreciate it. Yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to go speak with the other taxing jurisdictions, get their approval, and then come back to you all probably August, September-ish.
Any other questions? Seeing none, again, this was for information only. I do offer my more than happy to accompany any of you to hear the community in our community. With that, we are adjourned for the evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.
Thank you. Good night.